There is an island at the bottom of the world that most people have heard of, and almost nobody actually knows. It sits below Australia, like something that fell off the continent and decided to stay put. The wind that reaches it has traveled uninterrupted across thousands of miles of Southern Ocean before it hits the coast, and when it does, it carries a cold that feels older than anything you can name. The island is Tasmania, and the deeper you go into its history, the more you realize that everything you thought you understood about ancient human civilization, about isolation, about the capacity of people to survive at the very edge of the habitable world, begins to come apart in ways that no textbook has ever properly explained. This is not a story about convicts, though they came. It is not a story about colonial violence, though that happened too, and it was catastrophic. This is a story that begins much further back, in a time when the shape of the earth itself was different, when the sea had not yet risen to where it sits today, when human beings lived on a landscape that no longer exists in any form we can visit or map, and somewhere underneath the rainforest, underneath the dolerite cliffs, underneath the river sediment and the cave floors and the flooded valleys, that landscape is still there, preserved in a cold and silence that has lasted longer than most civilizations have existed. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Tasmania sits on a piece of the planet's crust that is, in geological terms, among the most ancient in the southern hemisphere. The rocks underneath the southwest corner of the island date back more than 1 billion years. Not millions, billions. The dolerite that forms the Great Central Plateau, those flat-topped mountains you see from the air when you fly into Hobart, intruded from below the surface roughly 180 million years ago, when Tasmania was still physically attached to Antarctica as part of the supercontinent we now call Gondwana. The process that created the Tasmanian landscape was slow, grinding, and almost incomprehensibly long. The same forces that eventually pulled Australia northward away from Antarctica left Tasmania clinging to the southeast corner of the continent, a fragment of the original southern landmass that never fully separated, never fully joined the drift north. What this means in practical terms is that when you are standing on the quartzite ridges of the southwest wilderness, you are standing on rock that formed before there were animals on land, before there were trees, before there was grass. The rock underneath your feet predates almost everything that makes the planet recognizable to a human eye, and that antiquity seeps into everything that came after. The soils that developed on it are thin and ancient and leached of nutrients. The plants that evolved on it are unlike plants almost anywhere else on Earth. The Gondwanic flora of the Tasmanian wilderness, the pencil pines and cushion plants and pandony and endemic species that exist nowhere else on the planet, are living descendants of the plant communities that existed when Australia and Antarctica were one landmass. They are, in the most literal sense, survivors of a world that no longer exists. And into this ancient, isolated, geologically strange place, human beings arrived. The question of exactly when is one that archaeology has been revising consistently in one direction, and that direction is always earlier. The current best evidence places human occupation of Tasmania at somewhere around 40,000 years ago, which already makes it one of the oldest known occupation sites in Australia. But the deeper the investigations go, the more that date gets pushed back. Majedbebe in the Northern Territory has now produced evidence of human occupation dating to 65,000 years ago. The implications of that date for Tasmania are significant. Because Tasmania was not a separate island 65,000 years ago, it was the southern tip of a much larger landmass. Bass Strait, the stretch of water that now separates Tasmania from mainland Australia, did not exist. In its place was a broad, low plain, probably savanna in places, probably interspersed with wetlands and forests, threaded by rivers that are now submerged. People moving south through Australia 65,000 years ago could simply walk to where Tasmania now stands. There was no crossing, there was no water. There was just land, stretching south until it reached the coast of what is now the Southern Ocean. So the occupation of Tasmania is not a separate event from the occupation of Australia. It is part of the same initial movement of human beings across the continent, following game and water sources and the logic of survival southward into a landscape that was cold and increasingly hostile but survivable. The people who reached the southwest corner of that ancient landmass did not know they were at the edge of the inhabited world. They did not know that the world's edge was what it was, because for them there was no edge. There was just the country they were in, and the country beyond it, and the country beyond that. And then the ice began to melt. The transition out of the last glacial maximum, the warmest phase of which was roughly 14,000 to 10,000 years ago, caused a sea level rise that was, by any measure, among the most dramatic events in human prehistory. Sea levels around the world rose by more than 120 meters over several thousand years. The Bass Plain, that wide, low savanna that connected Tasmania to the Australian mainland, began to flood. Slowly at first, then faster as the ice sheets collapsed, the water rose. Rivers became estuaries. Estuaries became bays. Bays became open sea. The plain disappeared under the Southern Ocean, and the people who were on the southern part of it, the people who were living in what is now Tasmania, found themselves on an island. Not suddenly, not overnight. Over generations, the sea crept closer. Over centuries, the coastline that had been miles to the north moved south, then closer still. The lakes and rivers and forest and game that existed on the base plain were gone. And eventually, the last corridor of land, probably a narrow ridge of higher ground that connected the far northwest of modern Tasmania to what is now Wilson's Promontory in Victoria, was submerged. The Tasmanian people were cut off, completely, absolutely, from the rest of humanity. What followed is the longest known period of human isolation in history. For approximately 10,000 years, the Palawa people, the Aboriginal Tasmanians, lived on an island completely separated from any other human population on Earth. No contact, no trade, no exchange of ideas or materials or genetic material. They were the most isolated human society that has ever existed, and they survived, more than survived. They developed a complex and sophisticated set of cultural practices, a rich spiritual life, an economic system perfectly adapted to the specific resources of a cold southern island, a set of social structures that managed kinship and territory and conflict in ways that sustained communities for millennia. But something happened during that isolation that has puzzled every researcher who has studied it. Something that does not fit any of the standard models of how human cultures develop over time. The Tasmanians lost things. Not in the ordinary way that technologies are lost when materials become unavailable or populations decline. They lost specific skills and technologies that archaeologists can document in the physical record. The most striking example is bone tools. The evidence from the earliest layers of Tasmanian cave sites shows that the people living in Tasmania during the coldest phase of the last glacial period were making and using bone tools with considerable sophistication. Pointed awls, needles, cutting implements, objects whose manufacture required a specific and learnable set of skills. And then, somewhere around 3,500 years ago, the bone tools disappear from the archaeological record. Not gradually, not in a way that suggests declining use or substitution by other materials. They just stop appearing. The fish taboo is the other great puzzle. When European observers first made sustained contact with Tasmanian Aboriginal people in the early 19th century, they documented something that seemed extraordinary. The Tasmanians did not eat scale fish. Not that they could not catch them. Not that fish were unavailable. The waters around Tasmania are cold and rich and full of fish. But the Tasmanians, who ate seals and shellfish and birds and marine mammals, did not eat finned fish. Some early observers thought this was simply a dietary preference, or perhaps a taboo that had developed for reasons of food safety. But the archaeological record makes the mystery deeper. The earliest Tasmanian cave sites, from the period before 3,500 years ago, contain fish bones. People were eating fish, and then the fish bones stop, at the same time as the bone tools stop. and nobody has ever produced a fully satisfying explanation for why. This is not a small puzzle. The loss of a food source in an island environment where every protein source is valuable, combined with the loss of a manufacturing technology that serves a wide range of practical purposes, happening at the same time, in an isolated population with no external pressures that the archaeological record can identify, is an event without any obvious parallel in human prehistory. Populations under stress tend to expand their resource base, not contract it. Populations with stable conditions tend to maintain and develop their technologies, not abandon them. The Middle Holocene in Tasmania does not show dramatic evidence of environmental crisis, and yet something changed, deeply and permanently, in what the people were doing and what they were choosing not to do. Some researchers have proposed that the changes represent a deliberate cultural choice, that the fish taboo was not a loss, but a decision, that the bone tool abandonment was not a regression, but a redirection of skill and effort toward other materials or other activities that have not been preserved in the archaeological record. This is plausible. It is also impossible to confirm. The cultural reasons for a taboo 3,500 years old, in a society with an oral tradition that was catastrophically disrupted during the colonial period, are not recoverable with any certainty. What remains is the physical record. And the physical record says that something changed, at a specific time, in ways that do not fit our standard models of how human cultures develop. The caves of Rocky Cape on the northwest coast of Tasmania are among the most important archaeological sites on the island. Two caves, known as North Cave and South Cave, contain stratified deposits that have been excavated and studied since the 1960s. The deposits in South Cave are particularly remarkable. They represent a continuous sequence of occupation spanning roughly 8,000 years. And within that sequence, the changes visible in the material culture track the same pattern visible across the island. The deeper layers contain the fish bones and bone tools. The upper layers contain neither. But there is something else about the Rocky Cape caves that has received less attention in the mainstream literature. The caves are embedded in quartzite headlands that jut into Bass Strait, and the rock of those headlands contains a series of fissures and passages that extend back from the main cave chambers further than the archaeological surveys have fully explored. The speleological assessment conducted in the early 1990s noted several passages that descended below the level of the primary occupation deposits and appeared to continue into the rock at depths and orientations that could not be explained by the simple weathering and erosion processes that formed the main caves. The assessment recommended further investigation. Further investigation has not been conducted. What the deeper sections of those passages might contain is unknown. It is possible they contain nothing of archaeological interest. It is possible they contain undisturbed sediments that predate the earliest currently known human occupation of Tasmania. It is possible they contain evidence of activity from a period so early that it would require a complete revision of everything we currently believe about the prehistory of the island. The rock is old enough. The depth is sufficient to protect from disturbance. The passages are there. Nobody has followed them to their end. The Kutakina Cave on the lower Franklin River is the most dramatic single archaeological site in Tasmania, and one of the most remarkable in the entire southern hemisphere. Discovered in 1981 during the campaign to prevent the damming of the Franklin and Gordon rivers, the cave was found to contain deposits of extraordinary depth and richness. The material within those deposits dated to between 14,000 and 20,000 years ago, placing it squarely in the last glacial maximum, the coldest period of the last ice age. At that time, the central highlands of Tasmania were covered by glaciers. The tree line had dropped hundreds of meters. The climate was brutally cold and the landscape was open tundra and periglacial scrub. And in the shelter of the Kutakina Cave, people were living. Not just surviving, living. The cave contained evidence of repeated, sustained occupation over thousands of years. Animal bones, predominantly those of Bennett's wallaby, showed the marks of systematic butchering and processing. Stone tools were present in large numbers, made from silicified mudstone from sources up to 80 kilometers from the cave. The people who occupied Kutakina were not scavenging or sheltering temporarily. They were using the cave as a base from which to exploit the surrounding landscape over many generations. At the time of the Franklin campaign, the discovery of Kootakina changed the political calculus of the dam debate in Australia. Here was physical evidence that the Gordon below Franklin wilderness contained some of the most significant archaeological sites on the continent. Here was proof that human beings had lived in the southwest Tasmanian wilderness during the last ice age, making it one of the southernmost known sites of human habitation during that period, comparable in latitude and harshness to the sites of the Cro-Magnon people in southern France. The Franklin River, which the dam would have submerged along with an unknown number of cave sites similar to or older than Kootakina, was saved. The dam was not built. The wilderness was protected. But the protection came at a cost that is rarely discussed. The campaign to save the Franklin succeeded, and then the archaeology largely stopped. The urgency of the political moment had driven the initial research. Once the dam proposal was defeated, and the area was declared a World Heritage Site, the institutional pressure to continue systematic archaeological investigation of the cave systems of the southwest dissolved. Some follow-up work was done in the years immediately after the discovery. But the southwest Tasmanian wilderness is extraordinarily remote and difficult to access. The rivers flood with minimal warning. The rainfall in the Gordon-Franklin catchment is among the highest in Australia. The logistics of sustained fieldwork in that environment are formidable and expensive. The result is that what was found in 1981 has been only partially explored. The cave systems of the southwest, of which Kootakina is one example among many, have not been systematically surveyed. The full extent of the archaeological resource within those systems is not known. The number of sites comparable to Kootakina that may exist further upstream, in areas that have never been surveyed by archaeologists, is genuinely unknown. The people who lived through the last ice age in the southwest Tasmanian wilderness left a record. Most of that record has never been read. The Gordon River, which runs through the heart of the wilderness, has a catchment of extraordinary complexity. The limestone karst underlying much of the southwest dissolves and reforms over geological time, creating cave systems of considerable extent and depth. Some of these systems have been explored by cavers, many have not. The survey work that has been done on the cave systems of the Arthur Pymon Conservation Area to the north, and the karst systems of the Florentine Valley and the Weld to the east, has identified cave passages of sufficient depth and age to potentially contain archaeological material older than anything currently documented in Tasmania. In 2003, a small team from the University of Tasmania conducted a preliminary archaeological assessment of 3 cave systems in the Upper Gordon River catchment that had been identified as potentially significant through aerial survey and cave survey maps. The assessment was never published as a formal academic paper. The notes from the assessment, held in the university's archaeology department, record the presence in one of the 3 caves of a deposit that the team considered anomalous. The deposit was at a depth that suggested it predated the known occupation sequence at Kootakina. The stone tool types present in the deposit were described in the notes as inconsistent with the assemblages from any of the currently known Tasmanian sites. The team recommended follow-up excavation. The follow-up excavation did not happen. The notes were not published. The cave is on record as having been surveyed. The survey results are in an unpublished internal report. This pattern, the preliminary finding that recommends follow-up, the follow-up that does not occur, the internal report that does not become a published paper, is not unique to Tasmania. It is a recurring feature of Australian archaeology in remote and logistically difficult environments. It is not a conspiracy. It is a consequence of funding structures, career incentives, and institutional inertia. The archaeology of the Tasmanian southwest is technically complex, physically demanding, and difficult to publish in the forms that drive academic careers. The result is that the most significant gaps in our knowledge of Tasmanian prehistory are precisely in the areas that are most difficult to access. The Tarkine Wilderness, which covers the northwest corner of Tasmania and is the largest temperate rainforest in the southern hemisphere, presents a different set of puzzles. The Tarkine is ancient in the way that Tasmania is generally ancient. Its forests are dominated by myrtle beech and sassafras, tree species with Gondwanic ancestry that have been present in essentially this form since before the separation of the southern continents. The rivers that run through it are dark, with tannins leached from buttongrass plains and peat. The ground is soft and wet, and forested in a way that makes systematic survey extremely difficult. But underneath the forest, on the ridges and at the edges of the wetlands, and in the clearings that form naturally around the margins of lakes, there are stone arrangements, not large megalithic structures, not things that photograph dramatically, subtle reorganizations of surface rock, placing of stones in patterns that are not geological, that do not result from water action or tree fall, or the natural movement of rock downslope. Stone circles of modest diameter. Lines of upright stones that follow ridgelines for distances that cannot be explained by accident. Cleared spaces on natural rock platforms where the rock has been swept clean of forest debris and maintained that way over long periods, as evidenced by the differential lichen growth on cleared and uncleared surfaces. These stone arrangements have been documented by a small number of researchers over the past 3 decades, but the documentation has been fragmentary and inconsistent. Some have been recorded in the site register of the Tasmanian Heritage Council. Others have not been formally recorded at all, existing only in the field notes of individual researchers or in the oral knowledge of the Palawa communities, who are the traditional custodians of the Tarkine country. The interpretation of these arrangements has been cautious in the academic literature, which tends to avoid the kind of speculative framing that would make the sites more publicly significant but less professionally defensible. The standard interpretation is that they represent cultural landscape modifications by the Palawa people, which is certainly true and certainly significant in itself. But the depth of soil covering the oldest of them, and the degree of lichen colonization on the stones, suggest that some of these arrangements are very old, older than the standard historical period that most Tasmanian archaeology focuses on. In 2007, a soil sample taken from beneath a stone arrangement in the central Tarkine returned an optically stimulated luminescent state that the researcher who took it described in a conference presentation as unexpected. The date was not published in a peer-reviewed journal, and the researcher has declined to discuss the specific figure in interviews since. What is known from attendees at that conference is that the date was considerably older than the Palawa occupation period. Most researchers had assumed the stone arrangement to represent. It was old enough to require reconsidering what was being done in the Tarkine, by whom, and when. The ochre quarries of the Tasmanian southwest are another element of the archaeological picture that deserves more attention than it has received. Ochre, the iron oxide pigment that shows up in burial sites and rock art across the ancient world, was economically important to Palawa communities in ways that are documented in early ethnographic records. The collection and preparation of ochre for ceremonial use was a significant activity, and in several locations in the southwest, particularly around the Arthur Range and in the upper Pieman River catchment, there are quarry sites where ochre has been extracted on a scale that goes well beyond what casual or occasional collection would explain. The quarries are not shallow surface scrapes. They are worked features, in some cases penetrating several meters into the hillside, showing evidence of systematic extraction over long periods. The stone tools used in the extraction, some of which are found in spoil deposits at the edges of the quarries, are worn in ways that indicate repeated use over many working sessions. The depth of some of the extraction pits, and the degree to which the surrounding rock has been reworked, suggest that these quarries were in use for a very long time. When uranium series dating was applied to mineral crusts overlying some of the tool deposits at one of the Arthur Range quarry sites in a 1994 study, the minimum age of deposition was estimated at somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 years, which places the use of that quarry firmly in the last glacial period, which means that people were extracting and processing ochre in the Tasmanian southwest during one of the most climatically hostile periods in the island's human history. The scale of that activity, during conditions that severe, implies something important about the cultural priority given to ochre and what it was used for. You do not work a quarry in a glacial landscape for casual or trivial purposes. The effort required to mine and process ochre at altitude, in cold, with simple stone tools, is substantial. The fact that it was done during the most extreme climatic period in the occupation record suggests that whatever ochre was used for in that culture, it was considered essential, not optional. Not decorative in a casual sense. Essential. The Pieman River runs west through the Tarkine to the Southern Ocean, and along its lower reaches, particularly around the Corinna area where the forest meets the tidal estuary, there are a series of rock surfaces that carry engravings, not painted art. Engravings cut or pecked into the surface of the rock itself in a form that is fundamentally permanent, in a way that pigment is not. Some of these engravings have been known to researchers since the mid-20th century. Others have been documented more recently, as systematic survey has expanded the area covered. The Pieman River engravings are not easy to classify. Tasmanian rock art is less studied than the rock art of mainland Australia, and the corpus is smaller and in some ways less varied. The majority of known Tasmanian rock art consists of geometric markings, circles, lines, grids, dot patterns. The interpretation of these marks is contested. Some researchers see them as territorial markers, boundary indicators, or records of significant events. Others have proposed astronomical or calendrical interpretations. The Palawa communities, who are the cultural custodians of these sites, have their own understandings of their significance, which are not always shared publicly, and which should be understood as authoritative in a way that academic interpretation is not. But among the Pieman River engravings, there are a small number of motifs that do not appear in the mainstream corpus of Tasmanian rock art, as it has been catalogued and described in the published literature. These motifs were first noted in a survey by a researcher from the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies in 1989. The researcher's field notes, held in the AIATSIS archive, describe 3 engraved panels near the lower Pieman, with imagery that she described as having no direct parallel in any previously documented Tasmanian site. The motifs in question are described as structured, multi-element compositions rather than single repeated marks. The field notes include sketches. The sketches show a level of compositional complexity that is unusual for the Tasmanian rock art record, as it is generally understood. The researcher submitted a report recommending further recording and analysis. The report was received and filed. No follow-up survey was funded. The panels have not been formally published in the peer-reviewed literature. Their location is known to a small number of researchers and to the traditional custodians of the area. They remain on the hillside above the Pieman River in the Tarkine rainforest, unread by any systematic scientific analysis. This is not, to be clear, evidence of suppression. It is evidence of under-resourcing. Tasmanian archaeology has never been lavishly funded. The state is small, its academic archaeology community is small, and the competing demands on the limited funding available mean that many sites that have been identified as potentially significant have received initial documentation and then waited, sometimes for decades, for the follow-up work that would allow their significance to be fully assessed. This is a structural problem with archaeology as a discipline in a country that does not treat its deep past as a primary cultural asset. It is not a conspiracy, but its effects are indistinguishable, in practical terms, from the effects of a deliberate decision to leave certain things unknown. The Lake Pedder controversy represents one of the most straightforward and also most painful examples of this pattern in Tasmanian history. Lake Pedder was a natural lake in the southwest wilderness, fed by the Serpentine River and bordered on its eastern shore by the most remarkable beach in Australia. The beach was a wide, pale, fine-grained quartzite strand that stretched along the lake's edge in conditions of solitude so complete that most of the people who ever saw it arrived by light aircraft or walked for days through the wilderness to reach it. The lake and its surrounds were placed under national park protection in 1955. In 1972, the lake was flooded to create a vastly enlarged reservoir for the hydroelectric scheme that was already drawing on the Gordon River to the south. The original lake, with its extraordinary beach, disappeared underwater that now covers it to a depth of several meters. Before the flooding, there was an archaeological survey of the lake's surrounds. It was conducted under time pressure by a small team with limited resources, and it covered a fraction of the area that would have been desirable to survey before the water rose. The survey found artifacts, stone tools, hearth deposits, evidence of occupation across multiple sites around the lake shore. The full extent of what was there was not determined, because the time was not available to determine it. The water rose, the sites went under. What the Lake Pedder survey found before the flooding, and what it would have found if it had been given adequate time and resources, is a matter of permanent speculation. The lakeshore environment, with its combination of fresh water, sheltered camping ground, and access to the quartzite resource that produced the fine-grained stone for some of the tool types found in the southwest sites, would have been a highly attractive location for repeated occupation over long periods of time. The beach itself, with its extraordinary extent of accessible quartzite, would have been a stone resource of considerable regional importance. The sites around Lake Pedder might have filled in significant portions of the occupation sequence for the southwest that remain poorly understood. They are gone now, under several meters of cold, dark water, and nobody will ever know what they contained. The Franklin River campaign, which succeeded in stopping the next proposed dam in the same system a decade later, was informed by the Lake Pedder experience. The archaeologists who found Kutakina in 1981 knew what the stakes were. They had watched Lake Pedder go under. They understood that the archaeology being found in the Franklin-Gordon system was exactly the kind of evidence that could change public understanding of what was at risk, and they were right. The discovery of Kutakina and of Dinarina Cave, further downstream, transformed the campaign and contributed to the World Heritage listing that protected the area. But the protection of the area has not been equivalent to the excavation of the area. The World Heritage listing was intended to preserve the natural and cultural values of the Southwest wilderness. It has done that, in the sense that the dams were not built and the wilderness was not flooded. But preservation is not the same as investigation. The caves and rock shelters and open sites of the Franklin-Gordon wilderness have been protected from flooding. They have not been systematically studied. The scale of the problem can be appreciated by considering the geography. The Southwest National Park covers approximately 600,000 hectares. Within that area, there are hundreds of kilometers of river valley with karst limestone, creating conditions suitable for cave formation and cave preservation of organic material. The number of cave sites that have been systematically surveyed by archaeologists is a small fraction of the number that the Geological Survey suggests should exist. Most of the Southwest is topographically inaccessible, without either helicopter access or multi-day walking expeditions. The effort required to conduct systematic archaeological survey in those conditions is enormous. The funding available for it is minimal. What this means is that the archaeological record of the Southwest Tasmanian wilderness, one of the most significant regions for understanding human prehistory in the Southern Hemisphere, is essentially unknown below a shallow layer of survey results from a handful of accessible cave sites. The deepest sequence we have, from Kutakina, tells us that people were living in the Southwest during the last glacial maximum. It does not tell us when people first arrived. It does not tell us what happened in the period between the glacial maximum and the later sequences visible in sites like Rocky Cape and other northern sites. It does not tell us what happened in the thousands of years of occupation that preceded the glacial maximum finds at Kutakina. The period before 20,000 years ago in Tasmania is effectively an archaeological blank, not because nothing was there, but because nobody has gone far enough to find it. The genetic story of the Palawa people is one of the most scientifically significant and also one of the most ethically fraught aspects of the Tasmanian mystery. The isolation of Tasmania for 10,000 years produced, in genetic terms, one of the most distinctive human populations on the planet. Studies of ancient DNA from Palawa skeletal remains, where those remains have been accessible to research and where Palawa communities have consented to such research, have revealed genetic signatures that reflect the extraordinary duration of that isolation. The Palawa genome is, in some ways, a time capsule. It contains variants that reflect the founding population's characteristics at the time of isolation, variants that were then maintained and further differentiated by 10,000 years of reproductive separation from the rest of humanity. Some of these variants have not been found in any other human population. Others have close relatives in mainland Australian Aboriginal populations, but show a degree of divergence that reflects the depth of the separation. The work of establishing the genetic history of the Palawa people has been complicated by the history of colonial collection of human remains. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the skeletal remains of Palawa people were collected by museums and scientific institutions in Australia and around the world in ways that were deeply disrespectful and that have caused ongoing harm to Palawa communities. The repatriation of those remains, which has been an ongoing process for several decades, has meant that the access of researchers to material for genetic study has been shaped by the legitimate decisions of Palawa communities about what research they consent to and under what conditions. This is as it should be. The remains of Palawa people are not scientific specimens, they are ancestors. The decisions about what research is conducted on them, and by whom, and under what framework, belong to the communities whose ancestors they are. But it means that the genetic history of one of the most isolated human populations ever to exist is known only in outline, and some of the most potentially significant questions about that history have not been investigated, either because the material is not available or because the communities have not given consent for specific research. What is known from the work that has been done is remarkable enough. The Palawa people were not, as some early researchers speculated, a relic of an earlier wave of human migration to Australia, distinct from the ancestors of mainland Aboriginal Australians. They were, in genetic terms, descended from the same founding population that colonized Australia. But the 10,000 years of isolation produced a degree of genetic differentiation that makes them, statistically, as distinct from mainland Aboriginal populations as those populations are from each other at the intercontinental scale. The implications of this for understanding what 10,000 years of human isolation does to a population, biologically, culturally, cognitively, are significant. We have only one example of this length and completeness of human isolation in the archaeological and genetic record. The Tasmanian case is unique, and the full investigation of what it can tell us about human evolution, human adaptation, and human cultural change has barely begun. The paradox of the canoe is perhaps the most philosophically puzzling element of the Tasmanian mystery. When British explorers and colonists began making sustained contact with Tasmanian Aboriginal people in the early 19th century, they documented a range of watercraft technologies. The most widely noted was the bark canoe, a simple vessel made from strips of bark tied into a bundle, used primarily in the rivers and estuaries and in sheltered coastal waters. The bark canoe was functional for its purpose. It was not, however, an ocean-going vessel. It could not have crossed Bass Strait. But the ancestors of the Palawa people did cross Bass Strait. Or, to be more precise, they arrived in Tasmania when it was still connected to the mainland, and they remained isolated after the connection was severed. The question that arises is whether, at any point during the 10,000 years of isolation, the Palawa people had watercraft capable of crossing Bass Strait, and the evidence, such as it is, suggests that by the time of European contact, they did not. This is strange. The shortest crossing of Bass Strait, from the Furneaux group of islands in the northeast to Wilson's Promontory on the mainland, is approximately 240 kilometers of open water. It is not a casual sail, but it is a distance that other Pacific Island cultures crossed in traditional watercraft, and the Palawa people at the time of isolation had 10,000 years ahead of them to develop the technology to do it, if they had been motivated to try. The fact that they apparently did not raises questions about isolation that go beyond the merely technological. Some researchers have proposed that the isolation produced, over thousands of years, a cultural orientation that was entirely continental in its reference points. That the world, for the Palawa people, was Tasmania. That Bass Strait was not a crossing to be made, but a horizon to be acknowledged. that the maintenance of sea contact with the mainland was never a cultural priority, because the mainland was not part of the Palawa world in any meaningful sense. This is speculative, but it fits what we know of how cultures adapt to their circumstances over long periods. Tasmania is a large island. It contains an enormous range of environments and resources. There was no practical necessity to cross Bay Strait. And in the absence of practical necessity, the absence of a technology to do so is not a deficiency. It is simply an adaptation to a world that was self-contained. But it adds another layer to the technological mystery. The same culture that 3,500 years before European contact abandoned bone tools and fish as a food source did not develop ocean-going watercraft during 10,000 years of island life. The pattern, viewed from a certain angle, suggests a culture that was contracting its technological range rather than expanding it over time. This interpretation is almost certainly too simple. The oral traditions and ceremonial practices and social structures of the Palawa people, which were extraordinarily rich and complex at the time of European contact, represent a form of cultural development that is not captured by a list of material technologies. The loss of bone tools and fish eating, whatever it represented, was accompanied by development in other domains that the archaeological record cannot fully document. But the puzzle remains. And it remains because the standard models of cultural evolution, which assume that populations under stable conditions will tend to maintain or increase their technological repertoire, cannot easily accommodate what happened in Tasmania. Something different was going on, something that the models have not yet fully explained. The relationship between the Palawa people and the rock art of Tasmania is one of the areas where the partnership between researchers and communities has produced the most careful and considered work. The geometric art tradition of Tasmania, which is distinct from the figurative traditions of some parts of mainland Australia, appears in cave sites and rock shelters across the island, with particular concentrations in the northwest and in parts of the Central Highlands. The art in the cave sites, where it is protected from weathering, is often in excellent condition. The art in exposed rock shelters has been subjected to weathering and lichen growth over long periods, making some panels difficult to read. The interpretation of the geometric tradition has been one of the persistent challenges of Tasmanian archaeology. The marks are not random. The patterns that appear are not the result of casual or absent-minded mark-making. They are structured, repeated, and in some cases, clearly relate to each other within a panel in ways that suggest intentional composition. But what they mean, what they record, what function they served in the cultural life of the people who made them, is not fully known. One of the approaches that has been most productive in recent years is working with Palawa community members who retain knowledge of the traditional contexts in which rock art was made and used. This is not an approach that produces results in the form of published academic papers with confident interpretations. It is an approach that produces understanding in a different form, understanding that is held within communities and shared on the community's terms. The published literature on Tasmanian rock art is not the full extent of what is understood about it. Some of the most significant understanding is not in the published literature, and that is appropriate. But it does mean that the archaeological and anthropological understanding of Tasmanian rock art that is publicly available is incomplete in ways that go beyond the simply under-researched. The gap between what is documented and what is known is partly a gap of resources and partly a gap of access. Both are real. Neither is easily bridged. The discovery in 2019 of a new ochre-decorated cave in the Lower Weld Valley, reported initially to the Tasmanian Heritage Council and then to researchers at the University of Tasmania, has not yet been the subject of a published archaeological assessment. The cave, which was found by a forestry worker during a timber survey, contains wall art in the form of ochre hand stencils and a series of geometric marks in a style consistent with the known Tasmanian tradition. But the cave also contains, at the back of its main chamber, a passage that descends into the rock at an angle and continues beyond the point where the initial survey stopped. The passage has not been fully explored. The cave is on the Heritage Register. It is not currently the subject of an active research program. The geological history of Tasmania contains an anomaly that has been understood in broad terms for some time, but has not been fully investigated in its implications for human prehistory. The anomaly is the dolomite karst of the Florentine Valley and the adjacent parts of the Weld and Styx river systems in the central southern highlands. This karst formed under different chemical conditions and at different depths than the limestone karst of the Arthur Pymon system in the northwest, and the cave systems that have developed within it are structurally distinct. They tend to be narrower, more vertical, and more deeply penetrating than the broad river caves of the northwest. They also tend to be wetter, fed by the extraordinary rainfall of the Central Highlands, and this has both preserved and complicated their archaeological potential. The sediment fills that might contain occupation deposits are present in some of the higher dry sections of these systems, but the flooding dynamics of the deeper sections have disturbed and sorted those fills in ways that make their archaeological interpretation difficult. A survey of 3 cave systems in the Upper Florentine catchment, conducted in 1997 as part of a broader archaeological assessment related to the Central Highlands hydroelectric scheme, found what the survey report describes as culturally modified surfaces in the entrance chambers of 2 of the systems. The modification consists of flattened and cleared areas of cave floor, in one case with a concentration of charcoal material that was not further dated or analyzed. The report recommended follow-up work. The hydroelectric assessment that commissioned the report was resolved without additional construction in the most sensitive areas. The follow-up work was never funded separately. The caves sit in the Florentine Valley forest, which is the subject of ongoing logging controversy, and the heritage management of the area has been complicated by the overlap of conservation, forestry, and cultural heritage jurisdictions. The thermal springs of Tasmania are another element of the island's geological and cultural landscape that has received less archaeological attention than their potential warrants. Tasmania has a number of geothermally influenced spring systems, including the Hastings Caves thermal pool in the southeast and several less well-known spring systems in the far southwest. Hot spring environments are, globally, associated with prolonged human use. They provide reliable warm water in cold climates. They create distinctive plant communities that can be important food sources, and they appear to have had significant spiritual importance in many cultures. The Palawa oral tradition, as recorded by early ethnographers, includes references to warm water places in the landscape that are associated with specific spiritual significance. Some of these references correspond to known spring locations. Others correspond to areas that have not been investigated for geothermal activity. The most intriguing of these correspondences involves a location in the Upper Davy River catchment, in the heart of the Southwest National Park, where a Palawa narrative, recorded by the anthropologist N.J.B. Plumley in the 1960s, describes a warm place in the ground associated with a story of transformation and emergence. Plumley, whose work on Tasmanian Aboriginal languages and oral traditions represents one of the most significant bodies of documentation produced in the colonial period, noted the reference without being able to identify a corresponding physical feature. The geothermal survey data for the southwest is sparse. There has been no systematic investigation of whether the location in the narrative corresponds to an actual thermal feature. The narrative itself is held in the Plumley archive at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery. The relationship between Tasmania and the broader question of pre-Columbian contact across the Pacific is one of the more speculative but not entirely dismissible elements of the picture. The Pacific contact question, whether peoples of the Americas or Southeast Asia or Polynesia made contact with Australia before European colonization, has a long and contentious history in Australian archaeology. The mainstream position has been cautious and somewhat resistant to the contact hypothesis, on the grounds that the genetic and archaeological evidence has not supported it. But the evidence base has been changing. The sweet potato, which is of South American origin, was present in Polynesia before European contact, establishing that Pacific peoples were navigating distances previously thought unlikely. The genetic evidence for Aboriginal Australian populations has also become more complex, with some studies detecting signals that could indicate ancient contact with South Asian or Southeast Asian populations. For Tasmania, specifically, the question of Pacific contact is even more speculative because the island's isolation for 10,000 years provides a strong prior argument against it. But that argument assumes that the isolation was maintained through the entire period, which the archaeological evidence cannot fully confirm because the archaeological evidence from the offshore islands of the Bass Strait group, which would be the most likely waypoints for any such contact, is very limited. The Hunter Islands, the Furneaux group, and the Kent group contain archaeological sites that indicate Palawa occupation at various periods. Some of those sites contain material that has been suggested as potentially introduced from external sources, though the mainstream interpretation has preferred local origin for all documented material. The Macquarie Island question, which lies much further south, is separate but related. Macquarie Island, an isolated volcanic platform in the Southern Ocean south of Tasmania, shows evidence of prehistoric human presence in the form of stone tool material that has been found on the island and dated to a period consistent with Palawa occupation of the broader region. How the people who made those tools reached Macquarie Island, which requires crossing hundreds of kilometers of open Southern Ocean, is not known. The bark canoe technology documented at European contact would not have been adequate for that crossing. Either the technology at that time was more capable than later documentation suggests, or the date of the material is incorrect, or there is something else going on that has not been explained. In 1986, a diving survey of the seafloor in the vicinity of the King Island group in the western Bass Strait found a concentration of stone material at a depth consistent with the coast of the Bass Plain during the sea level low stand of the last glacial maximum. The material was identified by the survey divers as including worked stone, specifically edge-retouched flakes of the type characteristic of the Tasmanian Pleistocene assemblages from sites like Kutakina. The survey was not an archaeological survey. The divers were conducting a marine survey for a different purpose and documented the stone material as a secondary observation. The material was photographed but not collected. The photographs and the survey notes were deposited with the Museum of Victoria. A follow-up archaeological assessment was proposed. It has not been conducted. The underwater archaeology of Bass Strait is perhaps the most significant single area of neglected research in Australian prehistory. The Bass Plain, which was exposed and habitable for approximately 50,000 years before being flooded, is now underwater to depths ranging from 50 to 80 meters across most of its extent. Underwater archaeology at those depths is technically demanding and expensive. It has not been attempted systematically. The sites that would have accumulated on the Bass Plain during 50,000 years of human occupation are there, preserved in the cold water under layers of marine sediment, waiting for the combination of technology, funding, and institutional will that would allow them to be found. When researchers have modeled the location of the most likely occupation sites on the Bass Plain, using a combination of the known sea level history, the topographic data from the modern seabed, and the ecological characteristics that would have attracted human settlement, the models identify a series of priority zones: river mouths, freshwater lake margins, sheltered bays where the coast existed during the low stand period. These are not large areas. They are specific, locatable, accessible in principle with the right equipment. None of them have been the subject of dedicated underwater archaeological survey. The Palawa people, at the time of their first sustained contact with European colonists, numbered somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals, distributed across the island in a series of named groups, each associated with specific territories. The actual population size at that moment is uncertain, in part because the groups had already been experiencing the effects of contact with sealers operating in the Bass Strait region for several decades before the formal colonial period began. The sealing industry, which expanded rapidly in the first decade of the 19th century, used the islands of Bass Strait as bases and interacted with Palawa communities in ways that were often violent and that introduced epidemic diseases to which the Palawa people had no immunity. The population collapse that followed formal colonization was catastrophic. Within 70 years of the establishment of the British colony of Van Diemen's Land in 1803, The Aboriginal Tasmanian population had been reduced to a single survivor of the mainland Palawa groups, a woman named Truganini who died in 1876. The speed and completeness of this collapse, combined with the declaration by some later commentators that the Tasmanians were extinct, produced a narrative of extinction that was used for ideological purposes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as supposed evidence for theories of racial hierarchy that have since been completely discredited. The reality is more complex. Truganini's death in 1876 did not represent the extinction of the Palawa people. There were and are significant Palawa communities descended from the Bass Strait Islander communities who maintained their identity and their connection to the island through the colonial period. Contemporary Palawa people number in the thousands. The declaration of extinction was a political act, not a demographic one, and it had consequences for how Tasmanian Aboriginal culture and prehistory has been researched and understood, because for most of the 20th century, the official position was that there were no Palawa people to consult about their own history. The subsequent recognition of Palawa communities and their rights has gradually changed this, but the damage done to the record by a century of research conducted without community involvement or consent is not fully reparable. The early colonial period in Tasmania also produced a specific type of document that is relevant to the archaeological puzzle. The records of the Van Diemen's Land Company, which was granted a vast tract of land in the northwest of the island in the 1820s, include survey reports from the late 1820s and early 1830s that describe the landscape in some detail. Among these reports are several that note the presence of features in the landscape that the surveyors could not explain on the basis of natural processes. Stone clearings on elevated ground, arranged rock features. In one case, a report by the company surveyor Thomas Scott, written in 1829 and held in the company archive, now preserved at the Public Records Office of Victoria, describes a feature on the high ground above the Arthur River that he describes as a circle of placed stones, each stone of similar size and placed upright in the soil at regular intervals around the perimeter of a cleared area of approximately 12 meters in diameter. Scott did not know what to make of the feature. He attributed it in his report to Aboriginal construction, which was almost certainly correct, but noted that the Palawa people in the area, when he asked them about it, declined to explain its purpose. He recommended that the feature be preserved and further investigated. The Van Diemen's Land Company did not follow up the recommendation. The feature is in an area that has since been cleared for grazing and subsequently partially reforested. Its current status is unknown. The Arthur River, which Scott was surveying in 1829, flows through country that is now part of the Tarkine Wilderness. The features he described, if they still exist under the regrown vegetation, are in an area that has had very limited systematic archaeological survey. The coordinates in his report are given in the survey notation of the period, which requires some work to convert to modern positioning. But the conversion has been done by a researcher at the University of Tasmania, who located the approximate area on modern topographic maps. A survey of the area was proposed in the researcher's 2014 thesis. The survey has not been conducted. The cave systems of the Juni Florentine karst area in the Central Highlands south of Medina are probably the most extensively explored cave systems in Tasmania from a speleological point of view. Juni Cave in particular is the resurgence point for a vast underground water system that extends through the karst for kilometers. Cavers have explored the accessible dry sections of the Juni system extensively, and some of those sections are very old in geological terms. But the archaeological potential of the Juni Florentine karst has been only partially assessed. The dry passages high in the system, above the active water flow, contain the types of sediment fills that are most likely to preserve occupation deposits. A survey of those dry passages in 2010 identified 4 candidate sections for archaeological assessment. The assessment of one of those sections has been conducted. The assessment of the others has not. The megafauna question, which is central to understanding the early occupation of Tasmania, involves a set of large animals that were present in Australia and Tasmania during the Pleistocene, and that disappeared. Depending on the species and the region, somewhere between 50,000 and 20,000 years ago. The extinction of the megafauna has been the subject of intense debate in Australian archaeology, with researchers dividing broadly between those who attribute the extinctions primarily to climate change at the end of the Pleistocene and those who argue that human hunting was the primary driver. In Tasmania, the megafauna extinction debate has a specific complication. The largest Tasmanian megafauna, including the giant short-faced kangaroo and the marsupial lion, disappeared from the Tasmanian fossil record at dates that precede the human occupation sequence that has been established from cave sites like Kutakina. But the occupation sequence in Tasmania only extends confidently to around 40,000 years ago in the current evidence, and the megafauna dates in Tasmania are not well established enough to determine whether they significantly predate or overlap with the earliest human presence. What is known is that the fossil record of Tasmanian megafauna has been recovered primarily from a small number of sites, predominantly cave sites in the central and northwest of the island, and that systematic survey for megafauna fossils has not been conducted across the full range of environments that would have been occupied by large herbivores. The southwest, which was the heartland of human occupation during the last glacial maximum, has not been systematically searched for megafauna remains. There is no theoretical reason why megafauna fossils should not be present in the cave deposits of the southwest. They have simply not been looked for in most of the southwest's accessible cave sites. The thylacine, or Tasmanian tiger, is the megafauna story that most people know. The extinction of the thylacine in the 20th century, the last known individual dying in the Hobart Zoo in 1936, is a documented and widely understood event. But the thylacine's earlier history in Tasmania is less well known and contains its own mysteries. The thylacine was widespread across mainland Australia until a few thousand years ago, when it disappeared from the mainland in circumstances that are associated with the arrival of the dingo. Dingoes did not reach Tasmania. The thylacine survived on the island as a living remnant of a population that had been extirpated from the mainland. The full genomic sequencing of preserved thylacine tissue, which has been conducted on museum specimens, has revealed that the thylacine population in Tasmania was small and genetically constrained at the time of European contact. The population had apparently passed through a genetic bottleneck within the last few thousand years, reducing its diversity significantly. What caused that bottleneck is not fully understood. One hypothesis involves human hunting pressure in the pre-colonial period. Another involves a population collapse triggered by disease or a climate event. The timing of the bottleneck in the mid-Holocene corresponds roughly with the period of the bone tool and fish taboo changes, suggesting that whatever happened in Tasmania around 3,500 years ago may have affected the thylacine population as well as the human cultural practices. This is speculative, but the correlation is not trivial. The question of contact with the outside world during the isolation period is one that has been approached from the genetic direction by a small number of researchers whose results have not yet been fully integrated into the mainstream archaeological narrative. The most relevant work involves the comparison of ancient DNA from pre-contact paleoskeletal material with the genomes of other populations. The studies that have been conducted in this area are limited in number and in the amount of material they have been able to analyze, for the reasons discussed earlier relating to community consent and repatriation. But the preliminary results have shown, in at least 2 independently conducted analyses, a signal that has been described as unexpected. The signal in question involves a small but statistically detectable component of the Palawa genome that does not correspond to the founding population's genetic background, as it can be reconstructed from the early colonization of Australia. In a fully isolated population maintained for 10,000 years, you would expect to see a genome that is a subset of the mainland Australian Aboriginal genome, differentiated by drift and local selection, but not containing novel components. What some of the analyses have found is a small component that has been characterized as possibly introduced at some point during the isolation period. The source of this component, if it is real and if it is introduced, is not identified by the analyses conducted so far. It is consistent with, among other possible sources, contact with Polynesian or Southeast Asian populations at some point in the last few thousand years. The researchers who have observed this signal have been cautious about its interpretation. Ancient DNA analysis on museum specimens has its own technical challenges, and contamination is a known issue in the field. The possibility that the signal represents contamination rather than genuine ancient admixture cannot be ruled out on the basis of the studies conducted so far. What can be said is that the signal has appeared in more than one independent analysis, using different methodologies, and that it has not been satisfactorily explained as a contamination artifact. The work needed to resolve the question, a dedicated, properly resourced study with full Palawa community involvement, has not yet been done. If the signal is real, the implications are significant. A population that maintained 10,000 years of isolation from the mainland but had some degree of contact with other Pacific peoples at a later period would require a revision of the isolation narrative that has been central to how Tasmania is understood in the anthropological, in literature. It would also provide a potential explanation for some of the cultural changes of the mid-Holocene, including the fish taboo and the bone tool disappearance, if those changes can be connected to the arrival of new cultural ideas from an external source. This is a long chain of speculation, but the basis of the first link in that chain, the anomalous genetic signal, appears in the data, and it has not been explained. The southeast corner of Tasmania, the region around the Huon and Derwent valleys, and the peninsula that juts into the D'Entrecasteaux Channel, was the heartland of one of the named Palawa groups at the time of European contact. The Nuanon people, who occupied the country around what is now Bruny Island, were among the first Palawa groups to experience sustained contact with European explorers and naturalists, beginning with the visits of D'Entrecasteaux in 1792 and 1793, and Baudin in 1802. The early French naturalists, particularly François Perron, produced descriptions of the Nuanon that are among the most detailed early accounts of any Palawa group. Among the observations that Perron recorded in his journals, which are held in the National Library of Australia and have been partially published in translation, is a description of a feature of the landscape that he found puzzling. Perron noted, during a walk inland from his landing point on Bruny Island, a series of stone constructions on elevated ground that he described as unlike anything he had seen in other parts of the Pacific that he had visited. He described them as low walls, not continuous but arranged in a pattern that suggested purposeful placement, enclosing cleared ground on the tops of several small hills in succession. He asked his Nuanon guide about the walls. The guide, according to Perron's account, indicated that they were old and that their maker was not known. The Perron journals have been studied primarily in the context of early contact history and natural history documentation. The stone wall reference has received very little attention in the archaeological literature. The hills on Bruny Island that correspond to Perron's description of his walk route have been subject to limited archaeological survey. A reconnaissance survey conducted in the 1990s found some evidence of stone arrangement on the elevated ground in the relevant area, but the survey was brief, and the features found were described as of uncertain age and significance. A more detailed survey has not been conducted. Bruny Island itself has been only partially surveyed archaeologically. The island contains a number of known Palawa sites, including shell middens and a cave with rock art. But the elevated interior, which Perron described as featuring the stone constructions, has not been the subject of systematic survey. The logistics of survey on the island are straightforward by Tasmanian wilderness standards. The funding has simply not been available for the work to be done. The relationship between the archaeology of the sub-Antarctic islands south of Tasmania and the Tasmanian mainland record is one of the less explored dimensions of the broader picture. The Macquarie Island material mentioned earlier is the most widely known component. But there are other islands in the Southern Ocean region, particularly in the Heard and MacDonald Islands group and around the Prince Edward and Crozet Islands in the Indian Ocean sector, where occasional anomalous finds have been reported in the literature of Southern Ocean exploration and scientific survey. The most relevant of these is a report from the French Antarctic Programme's survey of the Crozet Islands in the early 1970s, which documented the presence of stone circles and cleared platforms on the main island of Possession Island at a location inland from the coast. The French survey team was not conducting an archaeological survey. They were conducting a biological survey of the island's wildlife. The stone features were photographed and described in the survey report as of uncertain origin. The French researchers noted that the features were above the range of sea level surge from even major storms, and that their regular form was inconsistent with natural weathering patterns. A subsequent visit by a team that included an archaeologist from the Musée de l'Homme in Paris in 1977 produced a brief assessment of the features. The assessment concluded that they were probably the result of activity by early sealers working the region in the 19th century. But the assessment noted that some of the features were overlaid by lichen growth of a type and extent that the assessing archaeologist considered potentially inconsistent with a 19th century origin. Nothing further has been done with the Crozet Island stone features. They are in an environment that is controlled by the French Southern and Antarctic Territories Authority and is not accessible without official permission. The suggestion that they might predate the sealing era has not been further investigated. The subantarctic island archaeology, where it exists, is a field almost entirely shaped by the practical impossibility of systematic work in those environments. The islands are remote, the conditions are extreme, the logistics of sustained fieldwork are formidable, and the potential significance of archaeological findings there has not been sufficient to attract the funding required. But the Southern Ocean region and the island chains that dot it between Tasmania and Antarctica was not always the frozen and inhospitable landscape it is today. During the periods of warmer climate that punctuate the Pleistocene, some of the sub-Antarctic islands would have been accessible and potentially habitable for people with adequate watercraft. The extent to which the Southern Ocean was explored by prehistoric peoples in the period before the last glacial maximum is completely unknown. The wood-carving tradition of the Palawa people is an aspect of their material culture that has received very little scholarly attention, partly because the organic materials involved have not been preserved in the archaeological record. What is known from early ethnographic documentation is that the Palawa people carved and shaped wood for a range of practical and ceremonial purposes. The necklaces of Tasmanian kelp thong decorated with shells that were worn by Palawa women, documented by early observers and represented in several museum collections, show a level of fine motor skill and aesthetic intention that speaks to a broader tradition of working small materials with precision. But the wooden objects that would have represented the full extent of the carving tradition are gone, because wood does not survive in the Tasmanian climate outside of waterlogged or cave deposits, and neither of those preservation contexts has yielded significant wooden artifacts. The exception is a series of carved wooden objects, primarily throwing clubs and spears, that were collected during the colonial period and are now held in various museum collections around the world. These objects show a tradition of shaping and finishing that goes beyond the purely functional. The forms are regular, the surfaces are worked to a consistency that requires sustained attention, and some of the objects show decorative elements that are purely aesthetic. This is not a point that needs to be labored. The sophistication of Palawa material culture at the time of European contact is not in question among researchers. But it is relevant to the archaeological puzzle because it establishes that the technological capacity to work materials with precision and intention was present in Palawa culture throughout the period of historical documentation. The archaeological record of the earlier periods is not capturing the full range of what people were doing. It is capturing the small subset of what they were doing that happened to preserve in specific cave deposits under specific conditions. The question that this raises, and that cannot be fully answered, is how much of the early Tasmanian occupation record is simply absent from the archaeological picture because of preservation conditions. The 40,000-year sequence that is currently the basis for understanding Tasmanian prehistory is derived almost entirely from cave and rock shelter deposits in the northwest and southwest of the island. The areas between those deposits, and the period before the currently documented sequence are represented by very little. The absence is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of where people happened to shelter in ways that preserved organic material and where archaeologists have happened to look. The Wombat Creek Cave System in the Central Highlands northwest of Cradle Mountain was surveyed speleologically in the 1980s and found to contain a series of dry passages of considerable extent. One section of the system, known informally to the cavers who explored it as the Flat Room, contains a floor deposit that the cavers described in their survey notes as unusual. The floor in the Flat Room is not the natural breakdown rubble that characterizes most cave floors in the system. It is a relatively level, compacted surface with a fine sediment overlay. The cavers noted this in their survey and mentioned it to a researcher at the University of Tasmania's Geology Department, who visited the cave and confirmed the unusual nature of the floor deposit. The researcher recommended an archaeological assessment. The archaeological assessment has not been conducted. The Wombat Creek system is in an area of the Central Highlands that was subject to heavy snowpack during the last glacial maximum. The cave itself, at approximately 1,000 meters elevation, would have been close to or at the edge of the periglacial zone during the coldest periods. But the Flat Room, which is deep in the system and well insulated from surface temperature fluctuations, would have maintained a relatively stable temperature year-round. In a cold, treeless, periglacial landscape, a sheltered, wind-free, frost-free space of the type that a cave like the Flat Room provides would have been an extremely valuable resource. The fact that the floor deposit is unusual and that no one has formally assessed what it contains means that we do not know whether people sheltered in that cave during the last glacial maximum or earlier. The difficulty of doing archaeology in the Tasmanian Central Highlands is real. The area is remote, the access tracks are limited, and the conditions for fieldwork are challenging. But it is also true that the Central Highlands, which were the most climatically demanding part of the island during the glacial periods, are the area about which the least is known in terms of human prehistory. The few sites that are known in the Highlands, including some cave deposits in the vicinity of Lake St. Clair and in the Traveller Range, suggest that people did use the Highlands even during harsh periods. But the full extent of that use is unknown because the full extent of the site types in the Highlands has not been surveyed. The middens of the Tasmanian coast represent the most accessible and most extensively studied component of the island's archaeological record. Shell middens, the accumulations of shell material that result from the sustained harvesting of shellfish, are present along virtually the entire Tasmanian coast in various degrees of preservation. The middens range in age from the most recent historical period back to several thousand years before present. The oldest dated Tasmanian middens are from the northwest coast and go back approximately 5,000 to 6,000 years. No coastal middens have been dated to the Pleistocene period, which is consistent with the sea level history. The Pleistocene coastline of Tasmania was not where the modern coastline is, and the middens that accumulated on the Pleistocene coast are now underwater. The distribution of the known middens, and their varying degrees of research, reveals another aspect of the under-researched character of Tasmanian archaeology. The middens of the north and east coasts, in areas that are more accessible and that have been subject to development pressure that triggers heritage assessments, are relatively well documented. The middens of the south and west coasts, in areas that are remote and that have not been subject to development pressure, are much less well documented. Some sections of the southwest coastline have never been systematically surveyed for middens. The sites that exist there are known to be present, from aerial observation of the characteristic vegetation patterns that develop on old midden deposits, but they have not been ground-truthed or dated or assessed for their archaeological content. The Maatsuyker Island Group, a cluster of small islands at the extreme southern tip of Tasmania, has been subject to even less archaeological attention than the mainland southwest coast. The islands are now maintained as a lighthouse station and nature reserve. Early sealer records from the early 19th century mention the presence of what appear to be occupation deposits on some of the islands, but the question of whether those deposits represent pre-colonial Palawa use of the islands or Holocene use during periods when sea level and climate conditions were different from today, or something else entirely, has not been investigated. The lighthouse keepers who maintained the Matsuka Island station from the 1890s to the 1960s left a series of logbooks, some of which are held at the Tasmanian Archive and Heritage Office. Among the entries in these logbooks are occasional notes about features of the islands that the keepers found puzzling. One keeper, writing in the 1930s, describes finding a cleared area on the highest point of the main island, with a single large flat stone in the center that appeared to have been deliberately placed. The keeper noted that the stone was not of the type that occurs naturally on the island, and speculated that it had been brought from elsewhere. He reported the observation to the Public Works Department, which maintained the lighthouse. The department's response, if any, is not recorded in the logbooks. The keeper's observation has not been followed up by any subsequent survey. The waters around Tasmania contain their own layer of mystery in the form of the Tasmanian Seamount Chain, a series of underwater volcanic features that runs south-southwest from the Tasman Peninsula toward the Macquarie Ridge. The seamounts, which rise from depths of several thousand meters to within a few hundred meters of the surface in some cases, are biologically significant as the sites of extraordinary deep-water ecosystems. They have been the focus of research attention primarily from marine biologists interested in the cold water corals and fish communities that inhabit them. Their archaeological potential, as possible waypoints for prehistoric navigation in the Southern Ocean, has not been considered, because the conventional view has been that no prehistoric navigation occurred in these waters at the relevant distances. If that conventional view is wrong, if there was some degree of prehistoric navigation in the Southern Ocean south of Tasmania, then the seamount chain represents a series of submerged platforms that would have been more accessible and potentially habitable during periods of lower sea level. The highest points of some of the seamounts, at their current depths, represent elevated features that would have been exposed or very close to the surface during the glacial lowstand. Their potential as stopping points in a hypothetical prehistoric maritime network of the Southern Ocean is speculative in the extreme. But it is speculative in the same way that all pre-contact Pacific navigation was once speculative, before the evidence mounted to the point where it could no longer be dismissed. The point of all of this is not that Tasmania was the center of a lost civilization. The point is that what we know about Tasmanian prehistory is a tiny fraction of what there is to know, and that the fraction we know has been shaped by where archaeologists have been able to go, what conditions preserve material, what communities have consented to investigate, and what funding has been available. The story that can be told from the available evidence is already extraordinary. People lived through the last ice age at the southernmost inhabited point on Earth. They maintained a continuous culture for at least 40,000 years in isolation from the rest of humanity. They adapted to one of the most climatically extreme and geographically distinctive environments in the world. They created a spiritual and social life of extraordinary richness and complexity in conditions that would challenge the survival of any modern individual. That story is remarkable enough without embellishment, but the gaps in it are so large, and the potential for what those gaps contain is so significant that the continued under-resourcing of Tasmanian archaeological research represents a genuine failure of cultural and scientific priorities. The specific instance of the 1989 Aiatsis researcher and the Pieman River engravings speaks to a broader pattern that recurs throughout the history of Tasmanian archaeological research. Someone goes to the field. Someone finds something. The field notes are written. The recommendation for follow-up is made. And then nothing happens. Not because the finding was dismissed, not because anyone decided it was unimportant, but because the system of academic funding and institutional prioritization simply moves on to other things, and the follow-up never gets scheduled, and the years accumulate, and the recommendation sits in an archive. This is not a story of deliberate concealment. It is a story of a much more ordinary and in some ways more frustrating kind of institutional failure. The things that have been found in Tasmania are documented, at least partially. The recommendations that have been made are on record. The archives that hold the preliminary reports and the field notes and the survey assessments are accessible in principle to anyone with the time and the knowledge to find them. Nothing is hidden. Nothing is buried in a metaphorical sense. What is buried in a literal sense is the archaeological record that has not yet been excavated, and what is buried in the practical sense is the significance of what has been found, submerged under the vast weight of other priorities. The Tasmanian Archive and Heritage Office, which holds the records of colonial administration going back to the early 19th century, contains within it a series of files relating to Aboriginal heritage that have been only partially examined by researchers. The files in question are those generated by the early colonial administration in the period from the 1820s to the 1840s, when the dispossession of the Palawa people from their country was actively underway, and when the colonial administration was simultaneously documenting and destroying the culture it was encountering. The reports of the settlers who came into contact with Palawa sites, the observations of the government surveyors who mapped the country, the letters of missionaries and district commissioners who described the landscape before and after it was cleared for farming, all of these contain references to features of the landscape that were observed but not investigated. The most extensive collection of these references was compiled by the historian Lyndall Ryan in her research for her major work on the history of Aboriginal Tasmania, and the compilation identifies dozens of instances of colonial-era documentation of constructed features, cleared areas, stone arrangements, and other landscape modifications that were observed by settlers and surveyors in the early colonial period, but that have subsequently been either built over, cleared, or simply forgotten. Some of the features described in these records would be findable if anyone went looking for them. Some are in areas that have since been developed and are no longer accessible, and some are in the southwest and northwest wilderness areas that are protected and accessible but unsurveyed. The relationship between the colonial archive and the archaeological record is, in the Tasmanian case, particularly important because the colonial period was so destructive of the living culture that might otherwise have illuminated the physical record. On the mainland, the process of dispossession was also catastrophic, but it unfolded over a larger area and a longer period, and it was incomplete in the sense that some communities maintained their connection to country and their cultural knowledge through the colonial period in ways that are now contributing to archaeological research. In Tasmania, the combination of geographic isolation and the speed and completeness of the colonial population collapse meant that the living knowledge that would have explained the physical record was devastated more completely than almost anywhere else. What was saved came partly from the work of early observers who had the sensitivity to recognize what they were seeing. N.J.B. Plumley, whose work on Palawa languages and traditions represents the most significant single contribution to the documentary record, spent decades compiling the observations of early colonists and explorers and translating them into forms that could be preserved and analyzed. The breadth and detail of the Plumley archive is extraordinary, given the conditions under which it was assembled, but it is also, inevitably, partial. Plumley was working with the documentation of people who did not understand what they were observing, filtered through the assumptions and limitations of their time. The result is a record of extraordinary value that is also shot through with gaps and misunderstandings. The rehabilitation of Truganini's legacy over the past few decades represents one of the most significant shifts in the public understanding of Tasmanian history. Truganini, who was declared the last Aboriginal Tasmanian at the time of her death in 1876, was for most of the following century used as a symbol of extinction, a supposedly final proof that a people and a culture had been erased. Her skeletal remains, which were displayed in the Tasmanian Museum for many years after her death in violation of her explicitly stated wishes, became a focal point for the campaign by contemporary Palawa communities for the repatriation of ancestral remains. The repatriation of Truganini's remains in 1976 and her cremation, in accordance with her own instructions, was a landmark moment in the recognition of Palawa rights and identity. But it was also a moment that drew attention to the broader situation of Palawa cultural heritage and the extent to which it had been collected, displayed, and managed without community consent or involvement. The campaign for repatriation of remains from mainland and international institutions that followed, and that is still ongoing, has been driven by Palawa communities with remarkable tenacity and skill. The results have been significant but incomplete. The connection between repatriation and research is complex. The return of ancestral remains to country is not primarily a scientific matter. It is a matter of respect, of sovereignty, and of the rights of communities over the remains of their ancestors. But the process of repatriation, which has brought Palawa communities into sustained engagement with museums and research institutions around the world, has also created relationships and frameworks for collaboration that are slowly enabling a different kind of research. Research that is community-led, community-informed, and community-controlled. The first outputs of this different kind of research are beginning to appear in the literature, and they are producing interpretations of Tasmanian prehistory that are both more accurate and more complete than what could be produced by research conducted without community involvement. The work of the Tasmanian Aboriginal Land Council and the Aboriginal Land Council of Tasmania in managing and researching the land and cultural heritage that has been returned to Palawa control since the passage of the Aboriginal Lands Act in 1995 has produced a body of knowledge about the distribution and character of cultural sites in those returned lands that is not fully available in the public domain. This is appropriate. The communities are not obligated to share their knowledge with the world, and the process of developing the protocols and frameworks for sharing what they choose to share is ongoing. But it means that some of the most significant progress in understanding Tasmanian prehistory is happening in forms and contexts that are not visible to the broader public, and that the public narrative about what is known and what remains unknown is inevitably incomplete. There are aspects of the Tasmania story that have attracted speculation of a less careful kind, and it is worth addressing those directly, not to dismiss them entirely, but to locate them in the context of what the actual evidence shows. The claims, which circulate in various online communities and alternative history publications, that Tasmania was the site of a pre-Aboriginal civilization, or that the Palawa people were not the original inhabitants of the island, or that there is a connection between Tasmanian prehistory and global ancient civilizations of the type imagined by writers like Graham Hancock, are not supported by the archaeological, genetic, or geological evidence. The evidence consistently and clearly supports a picture of long, continuous Aboriginal occupation of Tasmania by the ancestors of the contemporary Palawa people. The mysteries of Tasmanian prehistory are real, but they are mysteries within the framework of the human story as we understand it, not mysteries that require a different story entirely. What the alternative history narratives get wrong, and why they are ultimately less interesting than the actual story, is that they replace a genuine mystery with a fake one. The genuine mystery of why bone tools disappeared from the Tasmanian record 3,500 years ago is more interesting than any invented story about a lost civilization, because the genuine mystery tells us something real about how human cultures work, or fail to work, in ways that we don't fully understand. The genuine mystery of what the underwater sites of the Bass Plain contain is more significant than any claimed evidence of an Atlantis-type civilization, because those underwater sites are real and their investigation would tell us something true about the earliest human occupation of the continent. The authentic puzzles of Tasmanian prehistory are strange and deep and genuinely unresolved, and they deserve to be encountered as what they are, not replaced by more dramatic but less truthful alternatives. The ochre-stained hands that pressed against the walls of caves in the southwest 20,000 years ago were the hands of real people, living in conditions of extraordinary difficulty and beauty, in a landscape that was unlike anything most modern people have seen. The stone arrangements on the ridges of the Tarkine were placed by real people, for reasons that are not fully known but that mattered to them and to their communities in ways that sustained the practice across generations. The fish taboo and the bone tool abandonment, whatever they represent, were the decisions of real people about what their culture would and would not include, decisions made for reasons that made sense within a framework of meaning that we can only partially access. The southern latitude of Tasmania, sitting between the 40th and 44th parallels south, puts it in a zone of weather that mariners called the Roaring Forties for good reason. The westerly winds in those latitudes unimpeded by any landmass between Tasmania and South America, generate seas and conditions that would challenge any watercraft. The people who lived on the coast of Tasmania for thousands of years knew those conditions intimately. They read the weather in ways that we cannot. They knew the behavior of the Southern Ocean with an accuracy born of direct dependence. When they chose not to venture into it beyond the range of bark canoes in the sheltered coastal waters, they were not limited by ignorance. They were making a judgment about risk and purpose that was informed by more direct and sustained experience of those waters than any modern person has. The relationship between the Palawa people and the sea was one of extraordinary intimacy and skill. The women divers, who are documented in early accounts as diving for shellfish in the cold southern waters without wetsuit protection, routinely operating in temperatures that would cause hypothermia in most modern people within minutes, represent a physiological adaptation and a learned skill that combined to produce a capacity that was central to the economic life of coastal communities. The knowledge of tidal patterns, current movements, seasonal availability of different shellfish and marine species, safe landing points in the irregular southwest coastline, all of this constituted a body of maritime knowledge that was precise and detailed and functionally essential. The early French naturalists who documented the Nuenon people on the d'Entrecasteaux Channel in the 1790s were struck by this competence. Perron, whose accounts of the people he met are some of the most detailed early observations, described watching a group of women and children work a rock shelf at low tide with a speed and assurance that he found extraordinary. The women were identifying shellfish locations underwater by surface observation, predicting with apparent accuracy where the best concentrations would be at each stage of the tidal cycle. This was not the primitive technology of people who had failed to develop more sophisticated methods. It was a highly sophisticated technology, developed and refined over generations, precisely adapted to the specific conditions of the specific coast where it was practiced. The Tasmanian coastal knowledge system, like the inland knowledge system, existed entirely in the minds of the people who held it. It was transmitted by practice and observation and oral tradition. It was not written down, and most of it was lost during the colonial collapse. What fragments remain in the early ethnographic record are significant, but they are fragments. The full extent of what the Palawa people knew about the Southern Ocean coast of Tasmania, accumulated over 40,000 or more years of sustained occupation, is not recoverable. This loss has consequences that extend beyond the cultural. The coastal ecology of Tasmania has changed dramatically since the colonial period. Sea temperatures have risen, species distributions have shifted. The kelp forests that were a primary feature of the Tasmanian underwater landscape and an important resource for coastal communities have contracted significantly. The baseline against which those changes are measured is largely the post-colonial ecological record. The pre-colonial baseline, which would have been shaped by 40,000 years of human interaction with the coast, is only accessible through the archaeological record, particularly through the shell middens that document which species were harvested in what quantities over long periods of time. The midden research that has been done in Tasmania has produced some significant insights into pre-colonial coastal ecology. The relative abundance of different shellfish species in midden deposits from different time periods shows patterns of change in the coastal ecosystem over millennia that are relevant to modern conservation biology. The abalone and muttonbird and sealbone frequencies in the middens document a coastal community that managed its resources with the kind of long-term orientation that the contemporary conservation discussion is only beginning to approximate. But the midden research has been limited in its coverage for the same reasons that all Tasmanian archaeological research has been limited. The most accessible middens have been studied, the least accessible have not. And the information that the least accessible middens might contain about the ecology of the southern and western coasts during the Holocene and earlier is not available. The granite pavements of the Tasmanian southwest, where the underlying rock has been exposed by glaciation and the subsequent removal of soil, provide the most durable surface available in the landscape for the preservation of features that require a hard substrate. Some of these pavements, particularly in the high country above the tree line in the southwest corner of the island, carry features that are not explained by geological processes. Lines of stones following the contours of the pavement at regular intervals. Cleared areas free of the frost-heaved debris that covers the surrounding pavement. Shallow depressions in the surface that have been filled and emptied of sediment by frost action, but that retain a regularity of form inconsistent with natural origin. These features were first documented by a geomorphologist from the University of Tasmania in the early 1990s, during fieldwork on periglacial landforms in the southwest. The geomorphologist, whose primary interest was the frost processes shaping the pavement surface, noted the anomalous features in a single paragraph of a report focused on other matters. The paragraph recommended that the features be examined by an archaeologist. The report was published as a technical document by the Antarctic Division. The recommendation was not followed up by the university's archaeology department, possibly because the report circulated in a geological rather than an archaeological network. The features are still there, on the granite pavements of the southwest, above the tree line, in country that is visited by very few people, and that has never been the subject of systematic archaeological survey at high elevation. The conditions for preservation on the exposed granite surfaces are very different from the conditions in the limestone caves. Stone arrangements on open pavement surfaces can survive indefinitely if the stones are of sufficient mass and the arrangement is not disturbed by flooding or tree throw. The frost heaving that disrupts finer features works more slowly on larger stones. An arrangement of stones of, say, 20 centimeters diameter or more, placed on a granite pavement surface above the frost disruption threshold, could survive for a very long time without significant alteration. How long is a very long time, in the context of the southwest Tasmanian highlands? The geomorphological record suggests that the granite pavements have been exposed in essentially their current form since the end of the last glaciation, roughly 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. Features placed on those pavements after their exposure would have been subject to frost and wind, but not to glacial overriding. A feature placed 15,000 years ago on the southwest highland pavement could, depending on its specific location and the character of the stones involved, be recognizable today. Whether the features documented by the geomorphologist date to 15,000 years ago, or to a more recent period, or represent something entirely different from what they appear to be, is unknown, because no archaeologist has gone to look at them. The high elevation, the remoteness, and the difficulty of logistical support for fieldwork in those conditions have prevented the most basic step of archaeological assessment from happening. The features sit on the granite, in the wind, in the same position they were in when the geomorphologist photographed them in 1992. And nobody has followed up. The story of what we know and do not know about Tasmanian prehistory is, in the end, a story about priorities. A society decides what it considers important enough to investigate, fund, and maintain. A discipline decides where its interests lie and what questions it considers worth pursuing. An institution decides what to archive and what to act on, and what to let sit. These decisions are not conspiratorial. They are the ordinary, unremarkable, and often unconscious expression of what a society values. And what the accumulation of those decisions in Tasmania shows is that the deep past of an island at the edge of the world has not been considered important enough to investigate with the sustained, systematic attention that its significance warrants. The 40,000-year occupation of Tasmania by the Palawa people is one of the most extraordinary chapters in the human story. The isolation, the adaptation, the survival through the last ice age, the cultural complexity maintained in conditions of extraordinary difficulty, all of it represents an achievement of human resilience that is without parallel in the archaeological record. The mysteries within that story, the bone tool disappearance, the fish taboo, the anomalous genetic signal, the unexplored cave systems, the unread rock art, the submerged coastlines, are real mysteries whose investigation would genuinely advance our understanding of what human beings are capable of. But advancing that understanding requires resources and relationships and time, and a willingness to sit with the discomfort of not knowing while the careful, slow work of proper investigation is done. It requires partnership with the communities whose heritage is at stake, conducted on terms that those communities set and in frameworks that those communities lead. It requires the kind of long-term institutional commitment that is difficult to sustain in a funding environment driven by short-term outputs. And it requires a recognition, on the part of the broader public and the institutions that respond to public priorities, that the deep past matters, not because it is exotic or mysterious, though it is both, but because it is part of the human story, and the human story is the only story we have. The caves of the southwest are still cold and dark and full of what they have always been full of. The stone arrangements of the Tarkine are still on their ridges, lichen-covered, patient. The Bass Strait is still above the plain that people walked across 15,000 years ago, its waters dark and cold over everything that was left behind. The Pieman River still runs west to the sea, past the rock faces with their unread marks. The granite pavements of the high southwest are still there in the wind, carrying whatever it is they carry. The deeper we dig into Tasmania, the stranger it gets. Not because there is something sinister underneath, but because the ordinary story of a people who survived at the edge of the habitable world for longer than almost any other human population, in conditions that stripped everything down to what mattered and kept only what was essential, is itself a strange and enormous thing. And we have barely begun to understand it. Something was happening in this place, over periods of time that dwarf everything we call history. Something is still happening in the Palawa communities who carry the thread of 40,000 years of occupation into the present. The past is not separate from the people who live with it. And in Tasmania, the people who live with it are still here, still connected to country, still the custodians of a story whose full depth none of us has yet read. The caves remember what was in them. The rock remembers what was cut into it. The sea floor remembers what was built above it before the water rose. Memory of that kind does not expire. It waits. Sometimes it waits for a geomorphologist to notice something in a pavement feature and write a paragraph. Sometimes it waits for a diver to look down and see worked stone on a seabed. Sometimes it waits for a community to decide that the time has come to share a story that has been held privately for a very long time. What it does not do is disappear. The record is there, incomplete and scattered and difficult, but there. And the longer we wait to read it properly, the more of the living knowledge that could help us read it is lost. The urgency is real. The opportunity is still present. And the story, whatever it turns out to be in its full dimensions, will be worth the effort required to find it. That is where the Tasmania story stands. Not at an ending. Not at a conclusion. At a threshold, with most of the building still unexplored, with the lights on in a few rooms and darkness in the rest, with something in the walls that has been making a sound for a very long time, and with the question of whether anyone is going to go and find out what it is. The question of why certain research gets done and why other research does not get done is, in the case of Tasmania, closely tied to the history of how the island has been understood by Australian culture more broadly. For most of Australian history, Tasmania was understood primarily through the lens of the colonial experience. It was the place where the British penal system sent its most troublesome convicts. It was the place where the final confrontations of the frontier wars between settlers and Aboriginal people played out with particular speed and completeness. It was the place where an ancient human culture was declared extinct within living memory, and where the shame of that declaration was managed, for a long time, by simply not looking at it. The environmental campaigns of the 1970s and 1980s changed this, in some ways and for some purposes. The Franklin campaign, which brought Tasmania to national and international attention as a place of extraordinary natural significance, created a framework within which the cultural heritage of the Southwest could be acknowledged as part of the argument for protection. Kutakina Cave was found at exactly the right moment to be useful to the campaign, and it was used. But the usefulness of the archaeological discovery to the campaign was also, in some ways, its limitation. Once the dam was stopped, and the World Heritage listing was secured, the urgency that had driven the initial discovery and documentation dissolved. Tasmania had served its purpose in the larger national and international conversation, and attention moved elsewhere. The archaeology that was done in the Franklin Gordon system in the early 1980s was good work, carefully conducted under difficult conditions by researchers who understood its significance. But it was work done under time pressure, without the kind of sustained, methodical approach that would have allowed the full character of the archaeological resource to be established. What was found because it needed to be found quickly, to make the case before the damn decision was made. What remained to be found after the political urgency dissolved has largely remained unfound. This dynamic, in which the research that gets done is shaped by political and economic pressures rather than by the logic of what the archaeological record requires, is not unique to Tasmania. It is a feature of heritage archaeology as it is practiced everywhere. The surveys that get funded are overwhelmingly those triggered by development proposals, where the cost of the survey is borne by the developer and where the purpose of the research is to determine whether heritage constraints will affect the development rather than to answer questions about the deep past. The research that is motivated by purely intellectual questions about human prehistory, in places where there is no development pressure to trigger a heritage assessment, is chronically underfunded everywhere. In Tasmania, where so much of the most significant archaeological potential lies in areas that are now protected wilderness rather than development zones, this pattern is particularly consequential. The Tasmanian Aboriginal Heritage Act of 1995 created a framework for the management of Aboriginal heritage in Tasmania that is in principle one of the more progressive in Australia. The legislation recognises Aboriginal people as the primary managers of their own heritage and creates mechanisms for community involvement in decision-making about research and management of heritage sites. The practical implementation of this framework has been imperfect, as is the case with most heritage legislation. Resources have been limited. The relationship between government heritage agencies and community organisations has not always been smooth, and the aspiration of community-led heritage management has not always been matched by the operational capacity to achieve it. But the direction of travel has been consistently toward greater community control, and the work that is done under community-led frameworks is producing results that earlier, more extractive approaches could not have produced. The recording of oral histories, the mapping of cultural landscapes, the identification of sites whose significance was known to communities but unknown to formal heritage registers, all of this work is happening, quietly and carefully, outside the mainstream of academic publication. Its outputs are in forms that serve community purposes, and that are held and controlled by communities. Some of it will eventually be shared in public forms, some of it will not, because there are aspects of cultural heritage that are appropriately held privately. All of it is contributing to a fuller picture of what happened in Tasmania over a very long period of time. The Melaleuca wetlands in the southwest, where walkers arrive by light aircraft at the most remote and least visited airstrip in Australia, are surrounded by buttongrass plains and tea tree heath that have an appearance of ancient stillness. The ground surface in those wetlands has never been systematically surveyed for archaeological material. The buttongrass plains that dominate the mid-altitude environment of the southwest are not a promising surface for finding stone tools or hearth deposits, but the margins of the wetlands, where seasonal drying exposes different sediment layers, and the edges of the permanent pools, where fresh water was consistently available, are environments that would have been used by people moving through the landscape over long periods. In 2016, a botanist conducting a plant survey in the Melaleuca wetland area found, at the eroded margin of one of the permanent pools, a small concentration of worked stone. The stone was silicified mudstone, the same material used in the tools from Kutikina and other southwest cave sites. The botanist photographed the material and reported it to the Tasmanian Heritage Council. A heritage officer visited the site the following year and confirmed the presence of worked stone in the eroded pool margin. The officer's report recommended archaeological assessment of the site and of the adjacent wetland margins. The assessment has been budgeted by the Parks and Wildlife Service, but has not been scheduled as of the last available program information. The Melaleuca material is significant because it suggests occupation of the open buttongrass wetland environment in the southwest, in addition to the cave occupation documented at Kutikina and the other Franklin Gordon sites. Open site occupation is harder to find and harder to date than cave site occupation, because there is no stratigraphic context provided by cave sediment to give temporal control. But open site occupation is also, typically, more extensive and more representative of the full range of activities that people engaged in across the landscape. The cave sites are places where people sheltered and processed food and used fire. The open sites are places where people moved across the landscape, stopped and worked stone, collected food, rested. The balance of what we know from caves versus what we know from open sites is heavily skewed toward the caves, because caves preserve better. But the actual occupation of the landscape was primarily open site occupation, and the open sites of the southwest are almost completely unknown. The relationship between the archaeological record of Tasmania and the global archaeological record of the last ice age is one that has been explored in the literature but deserves wider attention. The southwest Tasmanian sites, particularly Kutakina, place human beings in an environment during the last glacial maximum that is comparable in its extremity to the environments occupied by European Upper Paleolithic peoples in France and Spain during the same period. The comparison between the Kutakina assemblage and the assemblages from sites like Lascaux and Altamira has been made by researchers, though with appropriate caution about the very different cultural contexts. But the comparison illuminates something important about human capacity and human resilience that the Australian story tends not to receive credit for in the global narrative of prehistoric achievement. The narrative of human prehistory that has the widest public currency in the English-speaking world is disproportionately a European narrative. The achievements of the Upper Paleolithic in France and Spain, the cave art, the carved figurines, the blade tool technologies, are widely celebrated as the earliest clear evidence of modern human cognition and culture. The equally ancient, equally sophisticated, and, in some ways, equally remarkable achievements of the people who were living through the last glacial maximum in the southwest Tasmanian wilderness do not have the same public profile. They are not unknown. But they have not been incorporated into the global narrative of human prehistory in the way that their significance warrants. This is partly a matter of access. The cave art of Europe is visually spectacular and physically accessible. The Tasmanian ochre quarries and cave sites are neither. It is partly a matter of where archaeological research has historically been concentrated, which has been disproportionately in Europe and the Near East. And it is partly a matter of how the narrative of human progress has been constructed, which has tended to place European developments at the center and other developments at the margins. The southwest Tasmanians who were making and using fine stone tools in a periglacial landscape 20,000 years ago were doing something as cognitively and culturally sophisticated as anything being done anywhere else in the frayed world at the same time. They were not on the margins of the human story. They were the southern chapter of the same story, told in a different landscape by people who had found a different set of solutions to the same fundamental challenges. The challenges of life in the southwest Tasmanian wilderness during the last glacial maximum were formidable. The vegetation was open tundra and periglacial heath. The trees that exist in the region today, the great stands of Huon pine and King Billy pine and Antarctic beech, did not exist there in their current form. The tree line was several hundred meters lower than it is now, and the high country that the Kutakina cave system opened onto was exposed and cold. Wind speeds in the southwest during the glacial period would have been higher than they are today, because the polar front was further north and the pressure gradient between the cold south and the less cold north was greater. The cold itself was not Arctic. The southwest of Tasmania, even at the glacial maximum, did not experience the same temperatures as Central Europe during the same period, because the maritime influence of the surrounding ocean moderated the extremes. But it was cold enough, and wet enough, and exposed enough to make sustained occupation a genuine challenge. The people who met that challenge left behind, in the sediments of the caves they used, a record that has been only partially read. The stone tools tell us something about their technology. The animal bones tell us something about what they hunted and what they ate. The charcoal from their fires tells us when they were there. But the full character of their life, the social organization, the spiritual practices, the knowledge systems, the relationships between groups, the movement patterns across the landscape. All of this is either absent from the record or present only in fragments too small to assemble into a coherent picture. What the record does tell us is that they were there, consistently, repeatedly, over thousands of years. The multiple occupation episodes visible in the Kutikina stratigraphy are not evidence of a brief or desperate visit by people on the edge of survival. They are evidence of a sustainable pattern of use of a specific resource zone by a population that understood its environment well enough to return to it repeatedly under conditions that would have required careful planning and significant logistics. The stone used for tools, which was transported from sources up to 80 kilometers away, indicates a territory of considerable extent and a degree of planning and coordination in resource acquisition that goes well beyond immediate survival responses. The people who lived in the southwest Tasmanian wilderness during the last ice age were not struggling. They were not just barely surviving. They were living with the kind of competence and sophistication that comes from deep knowledge and long practice in a specific environment. And they left that environment before the warming came and moved with the changing conditions and maintained their connection to country through the extraordinary environmental transformation of the end of the Ice Age and continued living on the island that the rising sea created, adapting once again to a new set of conditions with the same fundamental competence and sophistication that had sustained them through the glacial period. The continuity of that adaptation, from the cold open landscape of the glacial maximum to the temperate rainforest and coastal environments of the Holocene, is itself remarkable. Most animal species either survived the end of the Ice Age or did not, as fixed physiological entities whose survival depended on whether their environment remained suitable. The Palawa people survived it by changing what they were doing, adapting their technology and their resource base and their knowledge systems to the transformed landscape that the warming produced. The bone tools of the glacial period, which were adapted to the specific requirements of processing the animals of the open tundra environment, were succeeded by different tool types suited to different purposes. The fish that became available as the sea rose and the estuaries formed became part of the diet. The forest resources that expanded as the tree line rose provided new materials and new food sources. And then, 3,500 years ago, something changed again. The bone tools went, the fish went. What came instead is not clearly visible in the archaeological record, which is the most frustrating aspect of the puzzle. If the abandonment of bone tools and fish eating represented a shift toward other forms of cultural activity, what were those forms? What was the equivalent in time, skill, and attention of the bone tool making that was no longer being done? The answer might be in the ochre quarrying, which was certainly intensive and which required sustained effort. The answer might be in the elaboration of ceremonies and social structures that have not preserved in the material record. The answer might be in the development of the oral tradition and the complex knowledge systems that the early ethnographic record documents, which might have expanded in the Middle Holocene as the material technology contracted. Or, the answer might be something else entirely, something that the current evidence does not allow us to see. That is the nature of the Tasmania mystery at its core. Not that there is no answer, but that the evidence available to us is insufficient to determine what the answer is. The archive is incomplete. The record has gaps. And in those gaps, the actual story of what was happening in Tasmania 3,500 years ago continues to wait for the investigation that has not yet been done. The water in the caves is still cold and clear. The rock art on the walls is still geometric and ancient and not fully understood. The stone arrangements on the Tarkine ridges are still there in the rain. The floor of Bass Strait is still above the plain where people walked and built their fires and raised their children and looked up at the same southern sky that you can see from Tasmania tonight. If you go somewhere dark enough and the clouds clear, the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. Not because the truth is stranger than anything we can imagine, but because the truth is larger than anything we have yet looked at fully. And in the gap between how much there is and how little we have seen, the mystery lies. Patient, cold, geological in its patience. waiting for someone to dig deeper. The dendrochronology of the Huon pine is one of the strangest and most beautiful facts about Tasmania. The Huon pine, Lagerostrobos franklinii, is a slow-growing conifer endemic to the wet southwestern rivers of the island. It grows at a rate of approximately 1 millimeter of diameter per year in favorable conditions, and considerably slower than that in the marginal habitats at the edges of its range. Individual living Huon pine trees have been found with ages exceeding 3,000 years. But the most extraordinary aspect of the Huon pine's relationship with time is what happens to it after it dies. The wood of the Huon pine is extraordinarily resistant to decay. It contains high concentrations of methyl eugenol and other compounds that inhibit the fungi and bacteria responsible for wood decomposition. Dead Huon pines in the wet southwest can persist as recognizable wood for thousands of years. Logs that fell into the rivers and were buried in the cold anoxic sediment of the riverbeds have been recovered with their cellular structure intact after burial periods of tens of thousands of years. The Franklin River, before and after the campaign to save it, has yielded Huon pine logs from its riverbed deposits that have been dated by radiocarbon to ages exceeding 30,000 years. This has implications for the archaeological potential of the southwest river systems that have not been fully explored. If wood can survive in the Franklin River sediments for 30,000 years, then wooden objects made and used by the people who occupied the southwest during and before the last glacial maximum could potentially survive in those same sediments, if they were deposited in conditions similar to those that preserved the pine logs. A wooden tool or a structural element of a temporary shelter or a piece of carved or worked wood that fell into a river 20,000 years ago and was buried in the cold anaerobic sediment might still be there, readable with the right analytical techniques, waiting for the survey that has not been commissioned. The underwater archaeology of the Franklin River sediments has not been attempted. The river is high and fast for much of the year, and the sediment depths required to find material from the last glacial period are substantial. But the same qualities that make survey difficult also make preservation excellent. The sediment that protects ancient material from disturbance is also the sediment that is difficult to reach with survey equipment. The two sides of the preservation paradox are inseparable. In 1988, a team of researchers from the Australian National University conducted a survey of the lower Gordon River below its junction with the Franklin, using a side-scan sonar system borrowed from the Marine Sciences program. The purpose of the survey was to map the riverbed topography in order to better understand the sediment dynamics of the World Heritage River System. The survey produced detailed maps of the riverbed morphology, and some of the maps showed features that the survey team described as anomalous in the sense that they were not consistent with the sediment dynamics being modeled. The anomalous features were concentrated in one section of the lower Gordon, in an area where the current slows and where the river deposits rather than erodes sediment. They were described in the survey report as possible concentrations of large woody debris buried under later sediment. The survey report was published as a technical document by the Tasmanian Department of Parks, Wildlife and Heritage. It recommended follow-up investigation of the anomalous features to determine their nature and to better understand the sediment history of the area. The follow-up investigation has not been conducted. The anomalous features remain in the riverbed, under the cold dark water, in the heart of the World Heritage Wilderness, that was saved specifically to protect the values that remain in it. Whether those features are concentrations of ancient Huon pine logs, as the survey team suggested, or whether they are something else, is not known. The possibility that they might include archaeological material is one that has not been formally assessed, because the survey that found them was not an archaeological survey, and its recommendations were not directed to an archaeological program. The connection between the extraordinary wood preservation characteristics of the Southwest River sediments and the potential for archaeological material in those sediments has not been made in any published form that has driven a research response. The natural history of the Tasmanian devil contains an element that is relevant to the archaeological puzzle. The Tasmanian devil, the largest surviving carnivorous marsupial, is endemic to Tasmania and has been the subject of sustained research attention in recent decades due to the devastating impact of devil facial tumor disease which emerged in the mid-1990s and has reduced the population by approximately 80%. The genetics of the devil have been studied extensively in the context of the disease and the conservation response to it, and those genetic studies have revealed a population history that contains some surprises. The genetic structure of the devil population shows evidence of a severe population bottleneck in the relatively recent past, somewhere in the range of a few hundred to a few thousand years ago. The bottleneck reduced the genetic diversity of the population substantially. The timing of the bottleneck corresponds, approximately, to the period of the bone tool and fish taboo changes in the human record. Whether there is a causal connection between whatever happened in the human cultural record around 3,500 years ago and the population crash that the devil's genetics suggests happened in a broadly similar period, completely unknown. But the correlation, along with the correlation of the thylacine genetic bottleneck mentioned earlier, adds another dimension to the puzzle of what was happening in Tasmania in the mid-Holocene. The devil, the thylacine, the human cultural changes. Three separate lines of evidence, from different disciplines with different methodologies, all pointing toward a period of significant change in the Tasmanian ecosystem, sometime in the mid to late Holocene. What caused that change, or those changes, or whether they are truly connected rather than coincidental, is not established. But the convergence of the signals is not trivial. Three independent lines of evidence pointing toward the same approximate period in an island system where the interactions between the human population and the native fauna were close and sustained suggests that something genuinely significant was happening in Tasmania somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 years ago. And whatever that something was, it is not clearly visible in any of the individual records, only in the pattern that emerges when you look at them together. The Huon Valley, in the southeast of Tasmania, contains a series of heritage sites that represent a different dimension of the Tasmanian archaeological picture. The valley was among the first areas settled by European colonists, and it retains a built heritage from the early colonial period that is significant by Australian standards. But beneath and alongside that colonial heritage is an Aboriginal heritage that predates it by thousands of years. The shell middens of the Huon estuary, some of which were already partially destroyed by agricultural development by the time systematic heritage assessment began in the late 20th century, document sustained Aboriginal occupation of the rich estuarine environment. The middens range in age from the Holocene through to the contact period, and their content documents the exploitation of the estuary's resources over a period of at least several thousand years. The D'Entrecasteaux Channel, which separates the Huon Peninsula from Bruny Island, was the heartland of the Nuanon people, and it retains both the physical remnants of Nuanon use and the documentary record created by the French voyagers who interacted with the Nuanon in the 1790s. The French accounts, particularly those of Perron and the naturalist Leschenault, are detailed enough to provide a basis for identifying the locations of some of the Nuanon use areas documented in those accounts. Some of those locations have been surveyed archaeologically, others have not. The relationship between the Nuanon and the specific resources of the channel, documented in the French accounts, shows a pattern of sophisticated resource management that involved moving between different parts of the channel at different times of year to exploit the seasonal availability of different food sources. This seasonal mobility pattern, which is typical of hunter-gatherer societies in environments with seasonal resource variation, left a specific footprint in the archaeological record, a distribution of sites and activity areas that reflects the structure of the annual round. Mapping that footprint systematically across the channel would require survey coverage that has not been achieved. The inland resources of the southeast, particularly the game and plant resources of the forested country behind the coastal margin, were also part of the Nuanon territory, and the French accounts record Nuanon people moving between the coast and the inland country. The sites associated with that inland movement, the temporary camps on ridges and at springs, the stone tool reduction locations where raw material was processed for transport, are not well documented archaeologically in the southeast. The heritage survey coverage of the southeast inland country is better than that of the southwest, because development pressure in the southeast has triggered more heritage assessments. But it is still incomplete. particularly in the more rugged country, away from the valley floors and the main development corridors. The Dolerite Plateau of the Midlands, which divides the eastern and western sides of Tasmania and runs north-south through the centre of the island, is the geological backbone of the interior. The plateau was used by Aboriginal people as a movement corridor between the eastern and western parts of the island, and it contains a series of heritage sites that document that use. The most significant of these are the quarry sites, where fine-grained dolerite was extracted for use as a cutting tool material. The dolerite quarries of the Tasmanian Midlands are known from early survey work, but the full extent of quarrying activity on the plateau has not been systematically mapped. The particular character of the dolerite, which fractures in a specific and predictable way that makes it useful for producing sharp flakes, means that dolerite quarrying sites have a distinctive signature that is recognizable to a trained eye on the surface. Cores and flakes and the distinctive byproducts of dolerite napping are visible at the surface at sites where quarrying occurred. A systematic survey of the plateau surface, using the dolerite quarrying signature as a locational guide, would likely identify dozens or hundreds of sites that are currently unrecorded. That survey has not been attempted. The Midland Lakes, including the Great Lake and the lakes of the Central Plateau, were subject to major engineering works in the first half of the 20th century. When the hydroelectric development of the Tasmanian interior began, the raising of the water levels in those lakes to serve the hydroelectric scheme inundated areas that had been used by Aboriginal people for thousands of years. The pre-inundation survey of those areas was minimal. The archaeological material that existed in the inundated zones is gone, as the Lake Pedder material is gone, permanently inaccessible under cold, fresh water. The hydroelectric development of the 20th century had another consequence that is relevant to the archaeological picture. The construction of the power lines, roads, and infrastructure that support the hydroelectric scheme required the disturbance of large areas of previously relatively undisturbed country. Survey of those construction corridors was not conducted. The sites disturbed or destroyed during that construction are unrecorded and unassessed. The scale of the disturbance is significant. Because the infrastructure corridors cut through country that had not previously been cleared or developed, and that therefore retained whatever archaeological material had accumulated over thousands of years of use, the formal heritage management system in Tasmania has improved significantly since the passage of the Aboriginal Lands Act and the development of the heritage legislation in the 1990s. But the legacy of undocumented disturbance from the earlier period of resource development cannot be undone. What was in the ground before the roads and power lines went in is mostly gone, and what remains around those corridors is accessible to survey but has not been systematically covered. The forest archaeology of the Tarkine and the southwest represents a final dimension of the Tasmanian mystery that deserves specific attention. Forest environments are notoriously difficult for surface archaeological survey because the ground surface is obscured by leaf litter and fallen timber and root systems that can move and disturb near-surface deposits. The forest floor archaeology of the Tarkine and the southwest is essentially unknown, not because people were not there, but because finding the material that they left is technically demanding and slow. The methodologies that have been developed in other forested environments for detecting archaeological sites through remote sensing, including airborne LiDAR and multispectral imaging, have been applied in Tasmania to a very limited extent. The Tarkine LiDAR survey that has been conducted for forest management purposes covers parts of the area, but has not been analysed for archaeological features. The application of archaeological LiDAR analysis to the Tarkine dataset, which is the equivalent of the LiDAR work that has transformed the understanding of pre-Columbian societies in the Amazon and the Maya area, has been proposed but not funded. The potential of LiDAR survey in the Tarkine and the southwest is genuinely significant. LiDAR can see through forest canopy and reveal the ground surface topography with a resolution sufficient to identify subtle cultural features like stone arrangements, cleared platforms, and mounded deposits. The same technology that revealed the extent of the Maya urban landscape under the forest of the Yucatan could, in principle, reveal features of the Tarkine and southwest Tasmanian landscape that are invisible at the ground level and have not been identified by any existing survey. What those features might be, if they exist, is unknown. But the case for finding out, in a World Heritage wilderness that has been protected specifically to preserve its cultural and natural values, seems straightforward. The cost of the LiDAR analysis of an existing dataset is modest compared to the cost of new fieldwork. The data already exists because the Forest Management Authority has already flown the LiDAR survey for other purposes. What is required is the analytical work to reprocess that data for archaeological feature detection and the subsequent field verification of any features identified. That work has been estimated by researchers at the University of Tasmania at a cost that is modest by the standards of major research grants. It has not been funded. This is where the story comes back to where it started, not with a dramatic discovery or a sensational claim, with a dataset sitting in a server, waiting to be analyzed, with field notes in an archive, waiting to be followed up, with caves on a map, waiting to be entered, with a floor in a forest, waiting to be looked at, with the question of what happened in Tasmania, in all of its specific and strange and genuinely mysterious dimensions, waiting for the resources and the attention and the sustained, careful, community-partnered work that would allow it to be answered. The island at the bottom of the world is still there. The wind is still coming off the Southern Ocean. The dolerite is still cold and the quartzite is still ancient, and the hewn pine logs are still buried in the river sediment with whatever is buried beside them. The caves are still waiting, the rock art is still geometric and unexplained, the stone arrangements are still on the ridges in the rain. And the deeper you dig into Tasmania, the stranger it gets. Not because there is something hiding, but because there is something enormous. An enormous span of time, an enormous achievement of human resilience, an enormous gap between what has been looked at and what is there to see. And in that gap, between the looking and the finding, between the evidence and the understanding, between the past that was and the present that has not yet fully attended to it, the mystery lives. It is geological in its patience. It is human in its significance. And it is waiting. The astronomical knowledge of the Palawa people is one of the least documented aspects of their intellectual life, and this is partly because the documentation that was done in the colonial period was conducted by people who were not asking the right questions, and partly because the disruption of the community by colonial violence happened so quickly that the transmission of specialized astronomical knowledge had very little time to occur before the primary knowledge holders were killed, removed from their country. What has survived in the fragmentary ethnographic record suggests that Palawa people had, as Aboriginal peoples across Australia are now known to have had, a sophisticated engagement with the night sky. The Palawa oral tradition contained astronomical references that were documented by early observers without being understood. Plumley's archive contains several instances in which Palawa informants described features of the sky in terms that the observers could not fully decode, because the names and narratives being used did not correspond to any framework the observers were familiar with. The Palawa sky was not the European sky. It was organized differently, named differently, and used for different purposes in the knowledge systems of the people who lived under it. The specific latitude of Tasmania, between 40 and 44 degrees south, means that the sky visible from the island is substantially different from the sky visible from most of the Australian mainland. The southern circumpolar stars, which are stars that never set below the horizon at Tasmanian latitudes, form a different and more complete set than is visible from further north. The Magellanic Clouds, the two companion galaxies to the Milky Way that are visible to the naked eye from the southern hemisphere, are prominent features of the Tasmanian sky in ways that they are not from northern Australian latitudes. The Southern Cross and the surrounding constellation of the False Cross and the Coal Sack, the great dark nebula that is visible to the naked eye as a dark patch in the Milky Way, are features of the southern sky that have specific importance in various Aboriginal knowledge systems. Whether the particular features of the sky that are visible from Tasmanian latitudes were incorporated into distinct Palawa astronomical knowledge, distinct from what is documented for mainland groups, is not known. The evidence to establish this does not exist in the form in which it would be needed to make the comparison. What can be said is that the southern sky is extraordinarily rich and spectacular in conditions of low light pollution, and that the southwest Tasmanian wilderness is one of the darkest places in the southern hemisphere from a light pollution perspective. The people who lived there for tens of thousands of years, sitting beside their fires in a landscape with no competing light, under a sky of extraordinary clarity, would have known that sky with an intimacy and precision that modern urban dwellers cannot approach. The potential for an astronomical dimension to the stone arrangements of the Tarkine and the southwest is one that has been mentioned in the academic literature without being formally investigated. If any of the stone arrangements are aligned with significant astronomical events, that alignment would be identifiable with relatively straightforward analysis of the orientations documented in site survey records. The orientations of the documented stone arrangements have been recorded in some cases and not in others. The analysis needed to identify any systematic astronomical patterns in those orientations has not been conducted because the dataset of documented arrangements is too small and too inconsistently recorded to support the analysis. The development of digital databases of Aboriginal heritage sites, which has been a priority for heritage management agencies in Australia over the past 2 decades, has improved the accessibility of the information that does exist about Tasmanian heritage sites. But the improvement in accessibility of the existing data does not address the fundamental problem, which is that the existing data is too sparse and too inconsistently recorded to support the kind of analysis that would reveal patterns in the record. The database is better organized than the earlier paper records, but it contains the same gaps, because the same sites have been surveyed and the same sites have not, and organizing the existing information better does not create information that does not exist. The Geographic Information Systems analysis of Tasmanian heritage site distributions has revealed some patterns that are potentially significant. When the known site locations are mapped against the landscape characteristics of the island, elevation, vegetation type, proximity to water, geology, and other variables, there are areas of the island that show site densities significantly higher than would be expected from a random distribution, and there are areas that show site densities significantly lower. Some of the high-density areas correspond to regions that have been well surveyed, and the high density may simply reflect the survey effort. But some of the high-density areas correspond to regions with specific landscape characteristics that suggest genuine concentrations of past activity. And some of the low-density areas correspond to regions where survey has been conducted but where the expected sites have not been found, suggesting that either the expectation is wrong or the survey has not been effective. The pattern of high sites in limestone and low sites in granite and quartzite, which reflects the preservation conditions in different rock types, is well established and well understood. But within the broad preservation pattern, there are specific areas that do not fit the expected model. There are limestone areas with good preservation conditions where the site density is lower than expected, and there are granite areas where preservation is poor, but where sites have been found that should not have survived as long as they have. These anomalies in the site distribution pattern have not been followed up with targeted survey designed to understand why the anomaly exists. The standard heritage survey approach is driven by development pressure and by the need to identify sites for management purposes. It is not driven by scientific questions about why the distribution is what it is. The scientific approach that would address the anomalies in the distribution pattern would require a different kind of survey, one designed to test specific hypotheses about where sites should and should not be found, and that kind of survey has not been done. The deep time perspective on Tasmania that emerges from the combination of the archaeological, genetic, environmental, and documentary evidence is one of the most complex and layered stories in Australian history. The island has been occupied by human beings for at least 40,000 years, possibly longer. It has been isolated from the rest of humanity for 10,000 of those years. It experienced a cultural change in the Middle Holocene that altered the pattern of technology and subsistence in ways that are not fully explained. It was decimated by colonial violence and epidemic disease in the early 19th century. It has been the site of extraordinary environmental and cultural contestation in the modern period, and it retains in its wilderness and its communities, and its archives, and its rock, and its river sediment, a depth of human story that has not been read. The reading of that story is possible, in principle, with the tools and the approaches and the partnerships that are available now. The obstacles are real, but not insurmountable. The resources required are modest by the standards of major research programs in other fields. The institutional will required is present in embryonic form in the heritage agencies and academic programs and community organizations that are working on these questions. What is lacking is the synthesis, the sustained and systematic effort that would bring the available tools and resources and partnerships to bear on the most significant questions in a coordinated and comprehensive way. That effort has not happened, not because the questions are not important, but because the importance of the questions has not been recognized at the level of decision-making where research priorities are set and research funding is allocated. The people making those decisions are, understandably, responding to the priorities that the public and the political system express. And the public and the political system have not yet fully understood what is at stake in the Tasmanian archaeological record. Part of the reason for that is the way the story has been told, or not told. The Tasmanian case has been presented, in the mainstream public narrative, primarily as a story about colonial violence, about the near genocide of the Palawa people, and the declaration of their extinction. That story is real and important and should be told. But it is not the whole story. It is the most recent chapter of a much longer narrative, and the earlier chapters of that narrative are extraordinary in their own right. The story of how people survived the last ice age at the southern tip of the habitable world is a story about human achievement. The story of what happened in the mid-Holocene, whatever it was, is a genuine mystery whose investigation would add to the understanding of how human cultures change over time. The story of the isolation, and what 10,000 years of being the most separated human society on Earth does to a people, is a story about the deepest questions of human identity and human adaptation. These stories have not been told in the public domain with anything like the depth and richness they deserve. They exist in academic papers that few people read, and in conference presentations that reach only specialists, and in community knowledge that is held privately for good reasons. They have not been translated into the kind of compelling public narrative that would make them part of the common understanding of what Australia is and what its deep past means. The telling of those stories is a task the telling is what makes the knowledge available to the decisions that determine whether more research happens. The people who fund archaeology respond to public interest. The public develops interest when the stories are told well. The stories will be told well when the people who know them find the forms and the audiences and the will to tell them, this is happening, slowly. It will happen faster if the questions are asked more loudly and the answers demanded more persistently. The island at the bottom of the world is patient. It has been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. The dolerite that forms its bones is 180 million years old. The limestone that sheltered its cave sites formed from the shells of organisms that lived and died in a sea that no longer exists. The ochre on the cave walls is mineral iron that formed deep in the earth and was brought to the surface and ground and mixed with water and pressed against stone in a hand that has been dust for tens of thousands of years. All of it is still there. The bones of the island, the caves in the limestone, the ochre on the walls, the worked stone in the river sediment, the stone arrangements in the forest, the floor deposits in the unexcavated passages, the features on the granite pavements, the anomaly in the genetic data, the organisms in the DNA of the thylacine, the anomalous floor in the cave that nobody has excavated, the engraved panels above the river that nobody has published, the archived recommendation that nobody has followed up. All of it is still there, patient, cold, geological, waiting. And if you go to Tasmania and you stand in the southwest wilderness on a clear night and look up at the southern sky, you are standing where people stood for longer than any other story we know. You are standing under the same sky they stood under. And if you are quiet enough and attentive enough and willing to sit with the strangeness of how much you do not know about the place you are standing in, you can feel the weight of it, the depth of it, the enormous, uncomfortable, wonderful depth of a place where the human story goes down much further than anyone has yet been willing to follow it. The deeper you dig into Tasmania, the stranger it gets. And the stranger it gets, the more clearly you can see that strange is not the same as wrong. It is the same as real. And real is what we need, even when real is difficult and incomplete and demanding and old in ways that make modern categories look very small. The island is still there, the past is still there, the mystery is still there. And we are, most of us, still standing at the edge of what is known, looking into what is not, wondering whether what we would find if we went further in would change everything we thought we understood about what it means to be human, to survive, to remember, to live in a place for so long that the place becomes part of what you are, in the same way that stone becomes part of the land, slowly, permanently, without any announcement. Maybe it would not change everything. Maybe the answers are simpler than the questions suggest. Maybe the caves contain exactly what the standard model predicts, and the stone arrangements are exactly what they appear to be, and the fish bones stopped, and the bone tools stopped for reasons that are perfectly ordinary by the standards of cultural change in small populations. Maybe, but we do not know. And we do not know because we have not looked, and we have not looked because something has kept us at the surface, moving across the top of the story without going down into it. The deeper you dig into Tasmania, the stranger it gets. Perhaps that is the real answer to why we haven't dug deeper. Not lack of resources, not lack of interest, not lack of technology, but something else. The sense, half articulate, that whatever is down there is going to complicate everything. That the full story of what happened on this island, at the bottom of the world, over a period of time so long that it swallows everything we call civilization, is going to require a reckoning. The reckoning is coming. Slowly, in the way that cold things move, in the way that stone changes shape, but coming. And when it arrives, Tasmania will have been here all along, patient, geological, strange, waiting for someone to finally dig deep enough to find what it has been keeping. What it has been keeping is not a secret. It is the human story, older and longer and more complex than the version we have been telling, and it is waiting for us to be ready to hear it. The petrology of the stone tools found in the southwest Tasmanian cave sites is itself a story that has not been told as fully as it deserves. When archaeologists recovered the lithic assemblages from Kutakina and the other Franklin Gordon sites in the early 1980s, they undertook sourcing analysis to determine where the raw materials used to make the tools had come from. The results were striking. The dominant raw material in the Kutakina assemblage, a silicified mudstone of excellent flaking quality, comes from outcrops located in the Crossing River and Upper Weld River catchments, approximately 70 to 80 kilometers from the cave site. In a landscape of glacial tundra and periglacial scrub, with no wheeled transport, no pack animals, and no permanent tracks, moving raw material 80 kilometers is not a casual undertaking. It requires planning, social organization, and a knowledge of the landscape that extends well beyond the immediate vicinity of the habitation site. The implications of this raw material distribution are significant. They suggest that the people who used Kutakina were not a small, isolated group confined to the immediate river valley. They were part of a social network that extended across a substantial area of the southwest and that had the capacity to move materials and presumably information across that area on a regular basis. The raw material sourcing results, in other words, are indirect evidence of a social geography that we cannot see directly in the cave deposits, but that is visible as an implication of what was found in them. Subsequent sourcing studies, conducted on assemblages from other southwest sites, have complicated and enriched this picture. Some sites show predominantly local raw materials, suggesting that the occupants were using what was available in the immediate vicinity rather than transporting materials from a distance. Other sites show material from multiple sources, suggesting that they were used by people who traveled between different parts of the southwest and brought materials from different places. The pattern, when mapped across the sites for which sourcing data is available, suggests a structured social landscape in which specific groups moved along specific routes and used specific resource areas in organized ways. But the sourcing data that exists covers only a subset of the known sites, and the known sites are only a subset of the sites that exist. the complete picture of raw material distribution across the southwest, which would reveal the full structure of the social geography of the Ice Age occupation, has not been assembled because the survey coverage is insufficient and the sourcing analyses that have been conducted are not comprehensive. The technical quality of the stone tool assemblages from the southwest sites is another aspect of the story that has not received the attention it deserves in the popular presentation of Tasmanian prehistory. The tools from Kutakina are not crude or simple. They include backed artifacts, tools made by the precise removal of a series of small flakes from one edge of a flake blank in order to create a blunt backing that allows the tool to be held or hafted, and thumbnail scrapers, small but formally well-made scrapers with carefully shaped working edges. Both of these tool types require control of the knapping process that goes beyond simply producing sharp flakes. They require the knappers to plan the tool form in advance, to select blanks with appropriate characteristics, and to execute a series of deliberate steps in a specific sequence. The backed artifact tradition in Australia is one of the distinctive features of the mid to late Holocene archaeological record on the mainland, where it is associated with the appearance of a range of other innovations that mark what archaeologists call the Australian small tool tradition. In Tasmania, backed artifacts appear in the Ice Age record at sites like Kutakina more than 15,000 years before they appear in the mainland record. This is one of the most puzzling single observations in Australian archaeology. The tools are similar enough in form to suggest a connection, but separated in time by such a large interval that the nature of any connection is deeply unclear. One interpretation is that the backed artifact tradition developed independently in Tasmania during the Ice Age, and then appeared later on the mainland through a process of invention or diffusion that has not been traced. Another interpretation is that the Tasmanian backed artifacts represent an early expression of a technological tradition that was more widespread during the Ice Age, and that has not been preserved elsewhere because the preservation conditions that kept the Kutakina assemblage intact do not exist in other parts of Australia. A third interpretation is that the similarity between the Ice Age Tasmanian tools and the later mainland tradition is superficial, and that the two represent independent, convergent solutions to similar functional problems. None of these interpretations has been definitively established. The data available from the Tasmanian sites is insufficient to resolve the question, and the mainland sites that would be needed to establish whether the tradition was more widespread during the Ice Age are either not preserved or have not been found. The backed artifact problem in Tasmania is a genuine puzzle in Australian archaeological theory, and it has not been resolved. The organic materials from the Kutakina assemblage, including the animal bone used for dating and faunal analysis, have provided a chronological framework for the site, but have not been analysed to their full potential. The bone assemblage includes remains of at least 15 different species, predominantly Bennett's wallaby, but also including wombat, echidna, and a range of smaller mammals and birds. The patterns of cut marks and burning on the bone, which reflect the ways that animals were processed for consumption, have been analysed in general terms, but not in the fine-grained way that would reveal the specific butchery sequences and the choices being made about which parts of the animal to process and which to discard. This fine-grained zooarchaeological analysis, which is now standard in the analysis of assemblages from other parts of the world, has been applied to very few Australian sites because it requires specialised expertise and significant time investment. The Kutakina bone assemblage, which is one of the richest and most significant faunal assemblages from the Ice Age period in Australia, has not received this level of analysis. What it might reveal about the specifics of subsistence practice in the southwest during the glacial maximum is unknown. The question of what the people of the southwest were eating beyond the Bennett's wallaby that dominates the Kutakina bone assemblage is one that the current evidence base cannot fully answer. The wallaby bones are abundant and well preserved, but the plant foods that would have made up a significant portion of the diet in any hunter-gatherer subsistence system are essentially absent from the record, because plant material does not preserve as well as bone in the cave deposit conditions of the southwest. Starch analysis, phytolith analysis, and other archaeobotanical techniques that can detect plant food residues in cave deposits have not been applied systematically to the Tasmanian southwest sites. The plant component of the Ice Age diet in the southwest is therefore essentially invisible in the current record, which creates a significant distortion in the picture of what life in the southwest was actually like. The waterlogged deposits that exist in some parts of the southwest, in bog margins and lake sediments and river floodplains, have better preservation conditions for organic material than the cave deposits. Plant remains, wood, bone, and potentially even woven or worked organic materials can survive in waterlogged anoxic sediments for very long periods. Some of the waterlogged deposits in the southwest have been dated to the Pleistocene period. None of them have been systematically surveyed for archaeological material. The potential for finding organic artifacts of the kind that wood, cordage, or bark working would produce in a waterlogged deposit dating to the Ice Age is genuinely present in parts of the southwest landscape. It has not been systematically investigated. The fire history of the southwest is another dimension of the evidence base that has been studied, but not exhaustively. Charcoal deposits in lake sediments, which record past fires in the surrounding landscape, have been analyzed for a number of sites in the southwest, and the results show patterns of burning activity that have been interpreted as evidence of human modification of the landscape. The timing and frequency of the burning events recorded in the lake sediment charcoal sequences correlate in some cases with the human occupation sequences from the cave sites, suggesting that the people who occupied the caves were also burning the surrounding landscape. Landscape burning by Aboriginal people is well documented across Australia as a land management practice with multiple purposes, including improving the productivity of game habitat, clearing travel routes, and creating fire mosaics that improve the overall biodiversity and productivity of the landscape. In the southwest Tasmanian context, the evidence for burning during the last glacial maximum is significant because it suggests that the people who occupied the southwest during the coldest period of the Ice Age were actively managing the landscape rather than simply reacting to it. They were not passive survivors in a hostile environment. They were active agents shaping the conditions of their own survival. The cessation of burning activity in the southwest, which is visible in some of the lake sediment charcoal records in the period following the end of the main occupation sequence at sites like Kutakina, is consistent with the picture of population withdrawal from the southwest as the climate warmed and the tree line rose. But the timing of the cessation is not perfectly synchronized across all sites, which suggests that the withdrawal was not uniform across the southwest and that some areas may have been occupied and burned for longer than others. The detailed chronology of the late Pleistocene to early Holocene transition in the southwest, which would reveal the specifics of how the human population responded to the warming, is not established with sufficient precision to answer these questions. The environmental transformation at the end of the last glacial maximum was one of the most significant events in the Tasmanian landscape history. The tree line rose by several hundred meters over a few thousand years. The periglacial scrub and tundra that had dominated the southwest was replaced by wet sclerophyll forest, and eventually by the rainforest that now covers most of the southwest wilderness. The animals that had sustained the Ice Age population, particularly the wallaby species that are most abundant in open grassland environments, retreated to the higher elevations as the forest expanded. The people who had built their subsistence system around those animals and that open landscape had to adapt. The adaptation is visible in the archaeological record in the form of a gap in the occupation sequence at the southwest cave sites. The upper levels of the Kutakina deposit, above the horizon dated to around 14,000 years ago, are essentially devoid of the material that fills the lower levels. The cave was not occupied, at least not intensively, during the period of maximum forest expansion in the early Holocene. The people who had used it during the Ice Age moved elsewhere as the conditions that made it useful changed. Where they went is one of the questions that the current evidence cannot fully answer. Some movement to the coast is likely, as the coastal resources expanded with the rising sea and the formation of new estuaries and sheltered bays. Some movement north, toward the less completely forested parts of the island, is also possible. The northern and eastern parts of Tasmania, which were never as heavily glaciated as the southwest, and which retained forest cover through much of the last glacial maximum, offered different environments and different resources, and would have become more accessible as the ice retreated from the Central Highlands. The linking of the Ice Age southwest population to the Holocene coastal populations, through the intermediate period of forest expansion and coastal resource development, is one of the largest gaps in the Tasmanian archaeological narrative. It is the period when the Bass Strait was being formed, when the island was taking shape, when the conditions that would define the Holocene occupation were establishing themselves. It is also the period that is least well represented in the archaeological record, because the sites of the transitional period are either in areas that have been surveyed but yielded little, or in areas that have not been surveyed, or on the seafloor under Bass Strait. The formation of Bass Strait itself is an event whose archaeological consequences have not been fully worked through. The isolation of the Tasmanian population was not instantaneous. The flooding of the base plain took several thousand years, during which the corridor of land connecting Tasmania to the mainland progressively narrowed and eventually broke. During that time, there would have been a period when crossing from one side to the other was possible but required watercraft. The technology of watercraft at that time is unknown. The question of whether people made the crossing during the narrowing of the corridor, maintaining contact between the two populations for longer than the simple flooding narrative suggests, is one that the genetic evidence could potentially address, but has not yet addressed with sufficient resolution. The social history of the isolation, the period during which the Tasmanian population went from being connected to the mainland to being permanently separated, is not recovered in the current evidence. It is one of the most significant events in human social history from the perspective of what it means for a population to be separated from the rest of its species. And it happened so slowly, over so many generations, that the people experiencing it cannot have perceived it as a distinct event. The world they lived in simply became, over the course of centuries, a world without access to what was on the other side of the water that was growing wider every year. The psychological and social consequences of that separation, if we could understand them, would tell us something important about how human communities handle the experience of being cut off. The cultural changes of the mid-Holocene, thousands of years after the separation was complete, might be related to the accumulated psychological and social effects of that isolation. Or they might not. The connection is speculative. But the question is real, and it is the kind of question that makes the Tasmanian case significant beyond its own specific details. It is a case study in human isolation that has no parallel in the documented record of our species. The birds of the Tasmanian southwest are part of the story in a way that has not been fully acknowledged. The orange-bellied parrot, one of the most endangered birds in Australia, breeds exclusively in the buttongrass plains of the southwest Tasmanian wilderness and migrates to the mainland coast for the winter. The swift parrot, which is also critically endangered, breeds in the forests of eastern Tasmania and migrates to mainland Australia. Both species are in severe decline due to habitat loss on the mainland. But they are also, in their migration routes and their breeding habitat requirements, living records of the connection between Tasmania and the mainland that preceded the formation of Bass Strait. The migratory patterns of Tasmanian birds, which have been shaped by the same geographical and climatic history that shaped the human occupation of the island, are a form of ecological memory. The swift parrot's breeding habitat is the flowering blue gum and black gum eucalyptus of the Tasmanian forest, which produces nectar that the parrot depends on for breeding. The blue gum and black gum are species with Gondwanic ancestry, part of the same ancient plant community that persisted in Tasmania through the glacial periods. The parrot's dependence on those trees, and the tree's presence in Tasmania, are both products of the same deep geological and ecological history that shapes everything about the island. The relationship between the Palawa people and the wildlife of Tasmania, which is documented in the early ethnographic record in terms of which species were hunted and how, includes observations about the birds and their seasonal movements that suggest a detailed knowledge of avian ecology built up over generations. The orange-bellied parrot, which was present on the buttongrass plains of the southwest in very large numbers before its recent decline, would have been a familiar and significant component of the southwest environment during the period of Ice Age occupation. Whether it was hunted is not documented. Whether it had specific significance in the cultural or spiritual life of the people of the southwest is not recorded. But its presence in the landscape, and the presence of the swift parrot and the other endemic birds of Tasmania, was part of the ecological context in which the human story of the island unfolded. The endemic species of Tasmania, the plants and animals that exist nowhere else on Earth, are a direct consequence of the island's geological and biogeographical history. They are the living residue of the Gondwanic connection, the Ice Age refugia, the long isolation, and the particular environmental conditions of the island. Some of them, like the Huon pine and the King Billy pine and the cushion plants of the southwest alpine areas, are direct descendants of Gondwanic plant lineages that existed when Australia and Antarctica were joined. Others are more recently differentiated species that evolved in Tasmania during the period of isolation from the mainland. The diversity and distinctiveness of Tasmanian endemic species is something that the island shares, in principle, though not in detail, with other ancient, isolated land masses. The biological uniqueness of Tasmania is a product of the same factors that make its human prehistory unique. The deep geological age, the long isolation, the extreme and varied environments, the cold climate that slows change and preserves the old. Tasmania is old in every sense, and the oldness has accumulated in the same way in the living community and in the physical record and in the human story. Everything about the island is older and stranger and more layered than it first appears, and the deeper you go into any one dimension of it, the more connections to all the other dimensions you find. The connection between the Thylacine and the human history of Tasmania is more intimate than the simple fact of coexistence. The Thylacine was the apex predator of the Tasmanian ecosystem, occupying a role that was shaped partly by the presence of large human hunters competing for the same prey. The relationship between the Thylacine and the Palawa people over 40,000 years of cohabitation is not documented in any direct form, but it shaped the ecology of both. The Thylacine's behavior, its hunting strategies, its territory, its prey selection, were all calibrated in relation to the human presence on the island. And the human hunting strategies, the seasonal movements, the resource management practices of the Palawa people were calibrated in relation to the Thylacine and the other large native fauna. This co-evolutionary relationship, which lasted for 40,000 years and was disrupted by colonization in a matter of decades, is invisible in the formal record. Neither the Thylacine's evolutionary genetics nor the human archaeological record captures it directly, but it was real, and it shaped everything about how both species lived. The Thylacine that died in the Hobart Zoo in 1936 was the last survivor of a lineage that had been shaped by 40,000 years of living alongside human beings. The Palawa people, who are its contemporary custodians, are the survivors of a culture that had been shaped by 40,000 years of living alongside the Thylacine. The loss of both, within the span of a generation and a half, represents an impoverishment that the island is still processing. The effort to recover some of what was lost, through genetic resurrection programs in the case of the Thylacine and through cultural revitalization programs in the case of Palawa communities, represents a different kind of reckoning with the depth of what the colonial period destroyed. The genetic resurrection of the Thylacine, if it succeeds, will produce an animal that is biologically close to the historical Thylacine, but that lacks the ecological knowledge and the behavioral repertoire that the Thylacine accumulated over millions of years of evolution in the Tasmanian environment. The cultural revitalization of the Palawa people, which is happening with genuine energy and skill, will produce a living culture that draws on everything that was preserved through the colonial period, but that is also an act of reconstruction from very limited materials. Both projects, the Thylacine resurrection and the Palawa cultural revitalization, are forms of archaeology. They are attempts to recover something from the past that was disrupted before it could be fully documented. They are, in different ways, responses to the same fundamental problem. The record is incomplete, the living thread was broken, and the work of understanding what was lost and recovering what can be recovered is long and difficult and important. The south of the island, the Cape at Southport, and the peninsula of Tasman looks across the Southern Ocean toward the Antarctic coast that Tasmania was once part of. On a clear day in winter, when the air has the clarity that only comes from wind that has traveled thousands of miles without meeting land, the ocean stretches south with a severity that makes the concept of the human scale feel very small. The people who lived on that cape, who looked south from those cliffs at the same ocean, were among the southernmost human beings alive during the periods of their occupation. They were at one edge of the habitable world, and they knew it, and they lived there anyway, and kept living there, for longer than we can currently count. The mystery of Tasmania is not a mystery of hidden chambers or secret civilizations or lost technologies in the exotic sense. It is a mystery of duration and depth and continuity. The mystery of how ordinary human beings, doing ordinary human things, thinking and feeling and loving and arguing and burying their dead and looking at the stars and making marks on stone, can do those things in the same place for so long that the time involved makes everything we call civilization look like a brief, bright moment at the end of a very long day. The deeper you dig into Tasmania, the stranger it gets. And the stranger it gets, the clearer it becomes that the strangeness is not other. It is us. It is the human story, in one of its longest and most isolated and most instructive forms, waiting to be read. What will you do with it? The specific character of the Palawa ceremonial life that was documented before it was disrupted is one of the most significant and least understood dimensions of the Tasmanian story. The ceremonies were, by the accounts of early observers who witnessed them, complex, sustained, and clearly important to the communities that performed them. They involved music, dance, fire, and what the early observers variously described as chant or song or speech in forms that they could not fully characterize. The descriptions are inadequate because the observers were not equipped, culturally or linguistically, to understand what they were witnessing. They saw movement and heard sound and observed fire and described those sensory experiences without being able to penetrate the meaning that organized them. The Palawa musical tradition, as it can be reconstructed from early observations and from the limited recordings that were made in the contact period, was distinctive. The instruments that have been documented include a form of percussion using hollow logs and rocks, and a form of vocal production that early observers described as unusual in its tonal quality. Whether there were other instruments, made from materials that have not been preserved, is unknown. The bone and wood that might have made whistles or flutes is not present in the archaeological record, but its absence does not establish that these instruments did not exist. It establishes only that if they were made, they were not preserved, or that they were not made in forms that would survive in the available preservation contexts. The singing traditions of the Palawa, which are recorded in fragmentary form in several early ethnographic sources, included both individual and group forms. The group singing was described by some observers as producing harmonics that were unexpected, as if the sound had more dimensions than the individual voices composing it would suggest. Whether this reflects a genuine acoustic phenomenon produced by deliberate technique, or simply the unfamiliar experience of hearing a harmonic tradition that the observers had no framework to analyze, is not determinable from the descriptions available. What it does suggest is that the Palawa vocal tradition was sophisticated and intentional in ways that the sparse documentary record cannot fully capture. The relationship between the Palawa ceremonial traditions and the landscape features of Tasmania is one that early observers noticed without being able to fully articulate. Specific locations in the landscape were associated with specific ceremonial practices. The names that the Palawa gave to places in their country reflected the spiritual and ceremonial significance of those places, not just their practical characteristics. The layer of meaning that overlaid the physical landscape, making it a ceremonial and cosmological map, as well as a practical resource map, was destroyed along with the communities that carried it. The physical landscape remains. The layer of meaning is largely gone. Some fragments of it survive in the Plumley archive and in the other early documentation. More of it may survive in forms that are held by contemporary Palawa communities and that are not publicly available. The work of recovering and reconstructing what can be recovered is ongoing, and it is producing results, but slowly and partially. The full significance of specific landscape features to the Palawa ceremonial life is not going to be fully recovered. The disruption was too complete and too rapid. But the partial recovery that is possible is valuable, and the effort to achieve it deserves more support than it currently receives. The Karagarap, the bark canoe that the Palawa women used in coastal waters, was a specific technology that combined the material properties of specific bark types with a manufacturing process and an operational technique that together produced a functional watercraft for the estuarine and sheltered coastal waters. Where it was used, the bark type most commonly used was the paper bark of the Melaleuca species, which grows in the coastal wetlands and along streams near the coast, and which has the right combination of flexibility and water resistance to be worked into a canoe form. The canoe was made by peeling bark sheets from the tree, shaping them into a hull form using binding of plant fiber cord and sealing the joints with resin. The operational technique for the bark canoe involved the women paddling in a kneeling position using paddles made from a single piece of wood. The canoe was inherently unstable by the standards of any rigid watercraft, but the women who used them had learned to manage the stability through body position and weight distribution from childhood, and they could operate in conditions that would capsize a less experienced user almost immediately. The cold water temperatures in the coastal waters around Tasmania meant that capsizing was a serious risk, and the skill required to avoid it was real and hard-won. The Palawa women's diving practice, which was conducted from the bark canoe as a platform and from rocks on the shore, was documented by several early observers in enough detail to give some sense of its characteristics. The women would enter water that the European observers found painfully cold, dive to depths of several meters, and collect shellfish from the bottom, often holding their breath for extended periods. The body adaptation required for this kind of sustained cold water diving, which is similar to the adaptations documented in the armor diving women of Japan and Korea, involves physiological responses to cold and apnea that develop over years of practice, and that may involve genetic predispositions as well as learned techniques. The economic importance of the women's diving to coastal Palawa communities was substantial. The shellfish harvested by diving provided a protein source that was reliable and high quality, particularly the abalone and sea urchin that are present in cold Tasmanian coastal waters. The diving also produced the raw materials for shell ornaments and necklaces, which were culturally significant objects that were traded and gifted across community boundaries. The Palawa necklace tradition, which uses the tiny shells of the Merina species threaded on lengths of kelp thong, is a craft that has been revived by contemporary Palawa women and that now represents one of the most significant living connections to the material culture of the pre-colonial period. The revival of the necklace tradition is not simply a craft revival. It is a restoration of a knowledge system that involves the identification and collection of specific shell species, the preparation of the kelp thong, the drilling or notching of the shells for stringing, and the aesthetic decisions about how to compose the strands in ways that are consistent with the traditional aesthetic. Each of those knowledge components was partially documented and partially survived in the memories of community members, and the reconstruction has required both research and creative reconstruction. The result is a living tradition that connects the present to a specific and ancient practice in a form that is owned and maintained by the community. The connection between the necklace tradition and the broader Palawa material culture is illustrative of the way in which specific craft practices can carry cultural knowledge that is not directly expressible in other forms. The knowledge of which shells to collect, where to find them, and what qualities to look for in selecting them is also knowledge of the coastal ecology and the seasonal patterns of shell availability. The knowledge of how to prepare the kelp thong, which involves specific harvesting and curing techniques, is knowledge of a marine material and its properties. The aesthetic decisions about composition are embedded in a tradition of visual judgment that reflects Palawa values and preferences that are not otherwise documented. In this sense, the necklace is an archive, not a written archive, but a three-dimensional one, carrying knowledge in a form that requires making to access. The person who makes the necklace, and makes it in the traditional way with the traditional materials, is doing something that is simultaneously practical and intellectual and spiritual, drawing on and perpetuating a body of knowledge that has its roots in the practices of people who made the same object thousands of years ago. The revitalization of the Palawa language is another form of archive recovery that is happening in parallel with the cultural revitalization more broadly. The Palawa Kani language that is being revived is a reconstruction based on the word lists and phrases recorded by early observers, primarily Plumley, from the last speakers of the original language group dialects. The original language was not a single unified language. It consisted of multiple dialects associated with different regional groups, and the differences between dialects were significant enough that speakers of one group's dialect did not always understand another group's dialect in the encounter period. The reconstructed Palawa Kani draws on materials from multiple dialects and is therefore a composite form that does not perfectly replicate any of the original dialects. The compromises involved in language reconstruction of this kind are real and acknowledged by the Palawa community members leading the revival. They are working with what exists, and what exists is not sufficient to fully restore what was lost. But the language they are creating is a functional, evolving, living language that is being used in ceremonies and everyday interactions and transmitted to children. And in that sense, it is doing what languages do. It is carrying cultural knowledge in a form that can be shared and developed and kept alive. The role of place names in the Palawa language revival is particularly significant for understanding the cultural landscape of the island. The Palawa names for landscape features encode information about the significance of those features in the Palawa world. A name that translates as something like the place where the wallaby drinks contains information about the ecology of the location. A name that translates as the stone that hears contains information about the spiritual significance of the feature. The recovery of Palawa place names, which is part of the broader language revival effort, is also a recovery of the layer of meaning that transformed the physical landscape into a cultural one. Some Palawa place names are already in common use in Tasmania. The name for the island itself, Nipaluna for what is now Hobart, Lutrawita for the island as a whole, are Palawa names that are increasingly used alongside or in place of the English names. The mapping of Palawa place names onto the Tasmanian landscape, which is a project that the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre and associated organisations have been working on for decades, is producing a different map of the island, one that layers the Palawa knowledge system onto the physical geography in a way that makes visible the cultural significance of the landscape for the people who have the deepest and longest relationship with it. The question of what the Palawa people would make of the current research agenda, of the priorities and gaps and institutional failures that this account has traced, is one that can only be answered by the Palawa communities themselves. But some general observations can be made on the basis of the public statements and the priorities expressed by Palawa organizations and Palawa individuals who have engaged with the research agenda. The consistent message from Palawa communities is that the research agenda should be driven by Palawa priorities, not by the priorities of external researchers or institutions. The questions that are most important to Palawa people are not necessarily the same as the questions that are most important to academic archaeology or to public narrative makers. The question of the bone tool disappearance, for example, which is a puzzle from the perspective of cultural evolutionary theory, may be a question that Palawa communities have frameworks for understanding that are not visible to external researchers. The question of the genetic anomaly, which is a puzzle from the perspective of population genetics, may be addressed by oral traditions that have not been recorded in the forms that scientific analysis could use. The partnership model of research, which treats Palawa communities not as research subjects but as research partners with their own knowledge and their own priorities and their own forms of understanding, is the model that is most likely to produce results that are both scientifically significant and culturally appropriate. It is also the most ethically defensible model because it respects the rights of communities to control the investigation of their own heritage. And it is the model that is most likely to access the full range of evidence Because the communities that have lived on this land for tens of thousands of years have forms of knowledge about it that are not available to researchers who approach it from the outside. The practical implications of the partnership model are significant. Research conducted in partnership with Palawa communities takes longer, requires more investment in relationship building and communication, and produces outputs in forms that may not map directly onto conventional academic publication. It also requires a degree of trust and reciprocity that develops only over time and through sustained engagement. Institutions that are accustomed to the project-based, grant-funded, publication-driven cycle of conventional academic research find the partnership model structurally difficult to sustain. But the knowledge it produces is worth the effort. The future of Tasmanian prehistory research, if it is to realize the potential of what Tasmania has to offer to the understanding of human history, will need to look different from the past. It will need to be more systematic, more sustained, more community-centered, and more willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, including into the parts of the record that are currently invisible because they have not been surveyed, or because the methods to detect them have not been applied, or because the questions that would reveal their significance have not been asked. The island is waiting for that future. It has been waiting patiently, in the way that islands wait, surrounded by sea, underneath the circumpolar sky, with the wind from the south making the same sound it has always made against the dolerite cliffs and the quartzite ridges and the limestone caves that have kept their cold and their darkness and their contents intact through everything. That has happened since the sea rose and the people found themselves alone. The deeper you dig into Tasmania, the stranger it gets. And the stranger it gets, the more clearly you can see that what makes it strange is also what makes it important. The duration, the isolation, the survival, the change, the mystery. The people who are still here, the descendants of the people who lived through everything Tasmania threw at them, who are carrying forward a story that began long before anyone was writing things down, and that is still being written. That story is incomplete. It will always be incomplete. But the portion of it that can be recovered, through archaeology and genetics and language revival and oral tradition and partnership and patience, is worth everything that the recovery requires. Because it is part of the human story, because it is one of the longest and strangest and most instructive chapters of the human story, because the people who lived it deserve to have it understood, and because the rest of us, who are the inheritors of a different set of stories, need to understand this one in order to understand ourselves. The island is at the bottom of the world. The wind comes from the south. The dolerite is cold and old. The caves are dark and waiting. And the story is longer than you thought, and stranger than you expected, and more real than any of the dramatic versions that would replace it with something simpler and more satisfying. The deeper you dig into Tasmania, the stranger it gets. That is not a warning. It is an invitation. The Cape Grim headland at the northwest tip of Tasmania stands at the point where the Southern Ocean meets Bass Strait. The Bureau of Meteorology has maintained an air quality monitoring station at Cape Grim since 1976, taking atmospheric measurements from wind that has crossed the Southern Ocean without touching any landmass between Cape Grim and the coast of Argentina or Chile. The air at Cape Grim is among the cleanest in the world by the standard measures of industrial pollutants, because it comes from a direction that industrialized civilization has not yet managed to fully contaminate. This same clean air, this same clear southerly wind, has been reaching the northwest coast of Tasmania for millions of years. The people who lived on that headland 10,000 years ago breathed air from the same direction, carrying the same ocean cold, bearing the smell of water that had traveled the same vast distances. The headland is the same headland. The wind is the same wind. The ocean is the same ocean. The scale of continuity is almost impossible to hold in the mind, and yet it is real. The people who walked along that coast before Bass Strait existed, who stood on the high points of the northwest and looked out at a sea that was hundreds of kilometers further away than it is now, are connected to the people who walk there today by an unbroken thread of human occupation that stretches across the entire depth of that time. The archaeology of Cape Grim and the surrounding headlands of the extreme northwest is limited. The region was the site of one of the most violent episodes of the Van Diemen's Land frontier period, the Cape Grim massacre of 1828, in which shepherds employed by the Van Diemen's Land Company killed at least 30 Palawa people who had been collecting shellfish on the beach below the headland. The massacre occurred in a location that had been used by Aboriginal people for thousands of years. The shell middens that document that long use are on the headland and along the coast in both directions, some of them undisturbed by the colonial period, some of them partially disturbed by the pastoral activities that followed it. The middens of the northwest coast, from Cape Grim south to the Arthur River, have been surveyed to a variable degree. Some sections of the coast have been covered by heritage assessments triggered by various management needs. Other sections have not been formally surveyed. The oldest material from the northwest coast middens dates to several thousand years before present, but this almost certainly reflects the depth of survey that has been done rather than the actual antiquity of the coastal occupation. The earliest coastal use in the northwest would have begun as the sea rose and the coastline formed in the early Holocene, and those earliest coastal sites are either deeply buried under later midden accumulation or have been eroded away by the severe wave action that affects the northwest coast in the prevailing southwesterly swell. The northwest coast of Tasmania is exposed to the full force of the Southern Ocean swells that travel unimpeded across the open ocean. The wave energy reaching that coast is among the highest in the world, and the coastal erosion rates reflect that energy. Sites on exposed headlands and beaches have been severely impacted by erosion over the millennia since the current coastline formed. Sites in sheltered locations, behind headlands, or in the lee of islands have survived better. The systematic identification of those sheltered locations and the survey of sites within them is work that has been partially done but is not complete. The offshore islands of the northwest coast, including the Hunter Island group and the Three Hummock Island, contain archaeological sites that reflect Holocene use by Palawa people. The sites on these islands have been surveyed to some degree, and they provide important evidence for the maritime capabilities of the coastal Palawa communities and for the seasonal patterns of movement that organize the use of different parts of the landscape. But the island surveys are not comprehensive, and the inter-island waters between the offshore islands and the mainland coast, which would have been used as movement corridors, have not been surveyed. The relationship between the northwest coast Palawa communities and the Furneaux group of islands in eastern Bass Strait is one of the more intriguing questions in Tasmanian maritime prehistory. The Furneaux group, which includes Flinders Island and the surrounding smaller islands, was a significant territory for a distinct Palawa group in the contact period. The isolation of those communities in the Bass Strait environment, with its particular combination of open ocean islands, rich sealing and fishing resources, and severe weather, produced a social and economic adaptation that is distinct from the mainland Tasmanian coastal communities. The archaeology of the Furneaux group is better developed than the archaeology of the offshore islands of the northwest coast, partly because the Furneaux group has been more accessible historically, and partly because the tragic story of Waibelena, the Aboriginal settlement established on Flinders Island during the removal period of the 1830s and 1840s, has generated historical attention that has also brought archaeological investigation. The Waibelena site has been studied in the historical and archaeological literature, and it represents a specific and painful chapter in the Tasmanian story that is distinct from the deep prehistory that this account has focused on. But the deep prehistory of the Furneaux group is present underneath the historical record. The islands were occupied before the historical period, during the broader framework of the Holocene coastal occupation. The sites that record that earlier occupation are present on the islands, in some cases very well preserved because the cool climate and the low human impact since the colonial period have created favorable preservation conditions. The older material is buried beneath or adjacent to the more recent material and requires more careful excavation to access. The question of the relationship between the Furneaux group communities and the adjacent mainland coast of Victoria, which is visible on clear days from the higher points of Flinders Island, is particularly interesting. The Furneaux group was connected to the Victorian coast by the Bass Plain before the sea rose, and the communities that occupied the islands after the sea rise would have been aware of the mainland to the north. Whether they had any contact with the Victorian Aboriginal communities across the open water of the eastern Bass Strait, and if so, what form that contact took, and what it meant for the isolation narrative of the broader Tasmanian story, are questions that the evidence cannot currently answer. The geographic isolation that Bass Strait created for the Palawa people was real, but it was not perfectly uniform across the island. The communities closest to the Bass Strait, on the north coast and the offshore islands, were closest to the possibility of contact with the mainland. Whether they perceived that possibility, whether they attempted to cross, and whether they succeeded, are unknowns that sit at the heart of the isolation narrative. The narrative of complete isolation for 10,000 years is compelling and has been influential in how Tasmania is understood. But it is a narrative that is based on absence of evidence rather than positive evidence of absence, and the difference between those two things is significant. The stone fish traps of the Tasmanian east coast are another element of the coastal archaeology that has been documented but not comprehensively assessed. Stone fish traps, which use the tidal range to trap fish in areas of rock shelf as the tide goes out, are present at several locations along the eastern coast of Tasmania and on some of the east coast islands. The technique is widespread in Aboriginal coastal archaeology in Australia, and the Tasmanian examples are consistent with the broader tradition. But the specific character of the Tasmanian fish traps and their relationship to the fish taboo documented in the mid-Holocene period raises questions that have not been resolved. If the Palawa people of the contact period did not eat scale fish, why are there fish traps in the coastal archaeological record? When were the traps made? When did they fall out of use? And what does their presence tell us about the fish taboo and its timing and geographical distribution? The east coast of Tasmania, from the Freycinet Peninsula south to the Tasman Peninsula, is a region with a different climate and ecology from the southwest and northwest. It is in the rain shadow of the Central Highlands, and it receives significantly less rainfall than the western parts of the island. The vegetation is different, the animal communities are different, the coastal configuration is different. The communities that occupied the east coast in the contact period had adapted to a distinctive environment, and the archaeological record of their occupation reflects those adaptations. The east coast middens are among the best documented in Tasmania, partly because of the relative accessibility of the region, and partly because the Freycinet National Park and other protected areas on the east coast have attracted heritage management interest. But even in this relatively well-studied region, the chronological depth of the record is not fully established. The oldest dated material from the East Coast sites goes back several thousand years. The question of how far back the East Coast occupation extends, and how the earliest occupation of the East Coast relates to the broader pattern of Holocene spread across the island from the Ice Age refugia in the southwest and northwest, is not settled. The answer to that question, and to the many other questions that this account has raised without resolving, lies in the ground, not metaphorically, literally. The evidence that would resolve the outstanding questions of Tasmanian prehistory is physically present in the sediments of the caves and the middens and the wetland deposits and the river sediments and the lake beds and the sea floor of the Bass Strait. It is there. It can be found. It can be analyzed. It can be understood, in partnership with the communities whose heritage it represents. What it takes is commitment. The commitment to ask the questions seriously and to fund the investigation thoroughly and to maintain the relationship with the communities who are the custodians of the heritage for long enough to do the work properly. The commitment to follow the evidence into the difficult places, the remote ones and the logistically demanding ones, and the ones where the answers might be complicated, and the ones where the answers might require revising things that seemed settled. The commitment to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, for as long as it takes to find out. Tasmania is old enough to wait. It has been waiting for this work for a very long time. The caves do not get impatient. The river sediment does not lose its memory. The ochre does not fade from the walls faster because nobody is looking at it. The past is where it always is, underneath the present, holding everything that happened before this moment, waiting for the moment when the present decides that what is underneath is worth knowing. The deeper you dig into Tasmania, the stranger it gets. And the stranger it gets, the more clearly you can see that the strangeness is the point. The strangeness is the human story. in its full depth and duration and complexity, refusing to be simplified or forgotten or replaced by something more comfortable. The strangeness is what makes it real, and what makes it real is what makes it worth it.